Hey guys, tonight we're slipping through the velvet curtains of Tudor England, the gilded trap where power, scandal and seduction brush elbows under flickering candlelight. If you've ever thought navigating modern relationships is tricky, imagine a place where one glance from the king can rewrite your entire life, or end it. Welcome to the forgotten lives of royal mistresses. These women were whispered about in corridors, painted over in family portraits, and often erased from the official story. But make no mistake, they were there in the shadows, manipulating the game as much as they were played. And just so we're clear, you probably won't survive this. Not with your head, anyway. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me what city you're in and what time it is as you're watching this. I love knowing who else is wandering the Tudor halls with me tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step into a world where the air always smells faintly of rosewater and political anxiety. The year, sometime in the early 1500s, and you're standing just outside the court of Henry VIII. You're not anyone special yet, but you're well born enough to be allowed inside the palace, close enough to taste the ambition on everyone's breath. The halls are crowded with silks and jewels and murmured flattery. Courtiers float past you like richly dressed ghosts. There are men with curled beards and feathered caps, and women whose gowns are so wide they could knock over a small army if they turned too fast. The court, at first glance, is a carnival of elegance. But spend even 5 minutes listening instead of looking, and you'll hear it, the sharp edge under every compliment, the performance in every laugh. Here, every person is both an actor and an audience. Everyone wants something, favour, advancement, protection, and nothing is more valuable than the king's gaze. When Henry VIII walks into a room, you feel it before you see him. The atmosphere shifts. Conversation dies for a beat, like the world holding its breath. Henry isn't just a man, he's a golden sun around which everyone else orbits, whether they want to or not. And if that sun happens to rest its light a little longer on one woman, well, things start happening. She'll be seated closer at banquets, dressed a little finer, given a locket with a small carved H. Soon the rumours start. Have you heard about Lady So-and-so? The murmurs travel fast, faster than any horse or pigeon ever could, and if the rumours are true, that woman may soon find herself holding power far beyond what she ever imagined, at a steep cost. Mistresses aren't just lovers, they're walking time bombs, their elevation is a threat to every political faction at court, to the Queen, to rival noble houses. And while they may receive gifts, land, jewels, servants, they're also always one misstep away from ruin. The king's affection is warm and intoxicating, yes, but also famously brief. When it cools, so does everyone else's. You walk through the garden paths where these liaisons often begin, half in jest, half in strategy. The hedges are high, privacy arranged like a chessboard. Young women brought to court as maids of honour are warned subtly by their mothers. Be charming, but not too charming. Catch the king's eye, but don't keep it too long. It's a game with no rulebook, only consequences. One of the strangest quirks of Tudor mistressdom? Everyone knows, but no one says it out loud. There's no official title for the king's current favourite. No crown, no seat in parliament. You're not a queen, but you wield the king's ear, and with that comes real terrifying influence. Yet it's not all drama and diamonds. In the quieter hours, late at night, behind embroidered curtains, the women who hold these roles sit alone, wondering how long their favour will last. Wondering what the Queen thinks, wondering what comes next. For every Anne Boleyn who rose, there were dozens who fell, silently and without ceremony. And let's not forget the less glamorous side of it. Being the king's mistress often meant being the target of venomous gossip. You might find yourself painted as a homewrecker in court poetry, mocked in anonymous pamphlets. Your family might gain favour, or be punished with you if you fall from grace. In some cases, the price is even higher. Prison, banishment, or worse. But despite the risks, young women still angled for that gaze. Why? Because for many, it was one of the few ways to change their fate. Marriage in noble England was rarely about love. You weren't a firstborn son or the heir to something enormous. Your future was basically arranged at birth. But catch the king's attention, you could leapfrog past all that. You might even become a duchess. Or for the boldest, a queen, and that's the academic debate still simmering under the surface. Were these mistresses victims of a predatory system? or agents navigating it with eyes wide open. Some scholars argue that the court was a gilded cage that used beauty and charm as bait. Others insist that these women were deeply strategic, choosing flirtation as a weapon. As usual, the truth is probably somewhere messier in the middle. Tonight, you're not just reading about these women. You're stepping into their slippers. You're walking with them through gardens, laughing carefully at the king's jokes, hiding letters behind tapestries. You're standing at windows with trembling hands, waiting to see if that knock means danger or another night of whispered power. So settle in. This isn't a fairy tale, but it's not quite a tragedy either. It's something in between, something very human. And tomorrow morning, when you brush your teeth or scroll your phone, you might just feel a little ghost of velvet under your fingertips. You hear her name whispered first in the presence chamber, tucked between an offhand joke and a sip of claret. Elizabeth Blount. Bessie, they call her. In the intimate way courtiers refer to someone they all think they know, but none can really claim. You follow the conversation like a stray scent through the palace corridors until you catch the full story, or at least the version that survives the retelling. She wasn't the most beautiful girl at court, they say, but there was something about her. A glow, a softness that belied sharp intuition, and most importantly she was first, the earliest publicly known mistress of Henry VIII. It starts simply enough. You're in the early 1510s now, and the court is still fresh-faced. Henry is young, barely 20, athletic, with that burning Plantagenet energy that hasn't yet turned to paranoia or gout. He's newly married to Catherine of Aragon, and though the political alliance is sound, there's one glaring issue. No surviving male heir. Enter Bessie, a 17-year-old maid of honour to the Queen, charming, quick-witted, and skilled at dancing. That last part matters more than you'd think. The court dances are no casual pastime. They're an audition. Every step, every twirl is a performance of grace, fertility, and obedience. You see Bessie on the floor, eyes trained carefully ahead, but always aware of who's watching. Henry notices. And once he notices, things unfold in the way they always do. Small tokens exchanged, quiet conversations behind arras curtains, a growing tension that soon makes its way into the gossip loops. What's curious is that Bessie doesn't fall into scandal, not immediately. There's no dramatic upheaval, no duels, no public denouncements. She fades into the role of royal favourite as if it were simply the next stage in her duties. And when she becomes pregnant, yes, with the king's child, there's no major public outcry. Why? Because of what happens next. In 1519, Bessie gives birth to a son, and not just any son, Henry Fitzroy, the king's first acknowledged illegitimate child. You can almost hear the gasp that runs through the Tudor nobility. Henry VIII, obsessed with legacy and virility, now has undeniable proof that he can sire a healthy male child. The problem must be Catherine, the whispers say, and this changes everything. Fitzroy is a curly-haired symbol of hope, a living embodiment of what the Tudor line could be if only a legitimate son would arrive. Henry is so proud, so thunderously smug about it, that he showers titles on the boy, Duke of Richmond and Somerset. You watch wide-eyed as a bastard child is lifted almost to the level of a prince. For a moment the rules seem different. And what of Bessie? For her part she doesn't claw for more. That's what makes her unusual. While later mistresses will scheme for elevation, for crowns, Bessie plays the long game by stepping back. She's quietly married off to a respectable nobleman, Gilbert Taleboys, and lives a life of relative peace. She vanishes from the court's inner circle before the tides can turn against her. It makes you wonder, was that her choice, or someone else's plan? Historians still debate this. Some say she was simply a girl who got lucky, caught the king's eye, and wisely retired once the favour cooled. Others believe she was nudged aside by ambitious families eager to place more strategic daughters in the royal path. Either way, Bessie escapes the fate of so many women who get too close to the throne. Disgrace, trial and sometimes execution. But let's take a moment to appreciate a strange little twist. Bessie Blount's son, Fitzroy, was at one point seriously considered as a possible heir to the throne. There were real discussions among Henry's advisors about legitimising him. In a different timeline, one nudge of fate away, you might have seen a King Henry IX born not of a queen, but a mistress. Fitzroy even had his own court, tutors and military training, but of course his story ends too soon. He dies at 17, probably of tuberculosis, and with him vanishes the closest thing Henry ever had to a male successor during his lifetime. You look back at Bessie with new eyes now. not as a footnote, not as a side character, but as a pivotal figure. The first mistress, the one who bore a prince in everything but name. Her story reminds you that power doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers it and walks away quietly. And here's a fun footnote that rarely makes the textbooks. It said Bessie once danced a series of courtly masks themed around fortune and fame right before catching the king's eye. Coincidence, maybe, or maybe the Tudors really were just that theatrical. Now, let's talk about the ghost in the room, the Queen. Catherine of Aragon, for all her devoutness and dignity, knew. Of course she did. But what could she do? In Tudor England, a queen's power wasn't in protest, it was in how she carried herself despite betrayal. Catherine doesn't rage publicly. Instead, she doubles down on piety, loyalty, and subtle performances of stoicism. You wonder what she really thought of Bessie. Did she pity her? Hate her? Dismiss her? That silence, too, is part of the story. What makes Bessie's story so compelling is that we forget her so easily. She isn't Anne Boleyn. She doesn't rise to a crown or fall to an axe. She isn't the face of the Protestant Reformation. She's just Bessie, sweet-faced, smart, sharp enough to step out before things got messy. She wins the king's attention, bears his son, and walks away with her head and reputation intact. In this blood-soaked drama of Tudor love and politics, that's practically a miracle. And here's the irony. In doing so little, she changes so much. She sets the precedent. She proves that mistresses aren't just distractions, they're players. And every woman who comes after her knows what's now possible, and what it might cost. You learn quickly that in Tudor England, no one arrives at court by accident, especially not the women. Behind every embroidered bodice and careful smile is a training regimen that would make a modern royal finishing school look like summer camp. From the moment a noble girl takes her first shaky steps on a marble floors, she's being shaped into something useful, graceful, silent and when needed, dazzling when required, and above all valuable. Tonight you step into that world, the polished upbringing of girls destined not just to serve, but to be noticed. You're inside a drafty manor house somewhere in the countryside. The air smells like beeswax and damp wool, and everything echoes a bit too much. Here, a young girl named Margaret, let's call her that, though her name isn't what matters, has just turned 6. Her governess is already correcting the way she curtsies. "No, your hand must be soft, like velvet," she murmurs, gently repositioning Margaret's fingers. It's not just about etiquette, it's choreography for survival. By 10, Margaret is learning to dance with a book balanced on her head. She can recite psalms in Latin and knows how to pass a goblet without spilling. More importantly, she's starting to understand court dynamics, the way her mother hushes when writing letters, the way her father's mood shifts depending on whose seal is stamped at the bottom. No one tells her directly, but the message is clear. Your body is a vessel for your family's ambition. She's being trained for the royal court, yes, but more specifically, for proximity. Proximity to queens, proximity to kings, to opportunity. Mistresses don't just appear beside the throne, they're cultivated, wrapped in layers of pedigree and polish. The goal isn't necessarily to become one, but if the stars align, you'll be ready. At 14, Margaret arrives at court, freshly perfumed and trembling in satin slippers. She's now officially a maid of honour, which is both a privilege and a meat grinder. The Queen, whichever one it happens to be at the time, has a glittering entourage of these young women. Their job? Accompany her, flatter her, sing when asked, dance when summoned, and pretend not to see what they inevitably will see. Affairs, power plays, poisonous alliances, but always with a smile. Being a maid of honour is the Tudor equivalent of walking into a lion's den wearing perfume made of steak. You're always being watched. Not just by the king, but by the other courtiers, the foreign ambassadors, the older ladies whose job is to monitor you like hawks in velvet. There's intense pressure to sparkle, but never outshine. Be witty, but never clever enough to threaten. You learn to speak in elegant riddles, to blush on cue, to cry just enough at a tragic ballad without smudging your coal. And then, of course, you learn how to flirt without flirting. This is an art form, and it's not optional. A glance that lingers a half-second longer. A subtle adjustment of your sleeve to reveal a sliver of wrist. A curtsy held just a bit deeper when the king walks past. You're coached in these things by older women who've seen it all, and by men who pretend not to be watching, though they absolutely are. Here's the kicker. None of this means you want to be the king's mistress. But if you are, It better be on your terms. The court is filled with cautionary tales, girls who rose too fast and crashed even faster, girls who misunderstood a smile and found themselves compromised, girls who said no at the wrong time and disappeared into unwanted marriages or quiet obscurity. There's a fringe detail here, almost laughable in its absurdity. Some noble families would position their daughters to be noticed. Not for scandal exactly, but for favour. A daughter in the king's graces might mean a grant of land, a title for a brother, a cushy appointment for a father. One of the more notorious cases involved a family dressing their daughter in foreign silks, rare and scandalously sheer, just for a single royal hunt. She was paraded like a rare falcon, and yes, she got noticed. Did she want to? That's harder to say. The real tragedy is that the line between préparation and exploitation was thin as lace. Were these girls empowered or manipulated? Modern historians argue both sides. Some insist these young women were pawns, traded for influence like jewelled game pieces. Others claim they were agents of their own destiny, flirting with power in a world where marriage was a trap and love, a luxury. You watch Margaret learn to walk that tightrope. She grows sharper, funnier, more aware of what she's doing and why. She learns that attention can be used like currency, spent carefully, hoarded or weaponized. And then one day, it happens. Margaret catches the king's eye. She's not even sure how. Maybe it was the song she sang at the winter masque. Maybe the deep green of her gown reminded him of something or someone. But suddenly he pauses when she speaks, smiles when she curtsies. His gaze lingers, her breath quickens, not with excitement but with a calculation, because now the game has changed. Her friends see it too. Some are envious, others wary. The Queen says nothing, but the flicker in her eyes during dinner is unmistakable. Margaret is invited to more events, given a better seat at the hunt. A ring, small and gold, appears on her pillow with no note. Everyone knows what this means, and yet no one says it aloud. This is how it begins, not with fireworks, but with subtle shifts in attention. The training, the years of instruction, all converging on this moment, and she has to ask herself, is this what I want? Can I control the... There's one final twist that sticks with you as you drift back from Margaret's world into your own. Many of these girls were taught from birth to suppress their instincts, to perform virtue and innocence, and then, one day, they're expected to pivot, to use seduction as a survival tool. And if they fail, they are discarded as if the script was never theirs to begin with. So as you lie back and think about Tudor mistresses, remember, before they were lovers, they were learners, forged in the fires of discipline, ambition, and silent games, and they played their parts as best they could, often with no idea what act would come next. You're standing in the centre of Whitehall Palace, watching history start to buckle and shudder like a timbered roof in a storm, and it's all because of two sisters, not royalty, not even nobles of the highest rank, just two well-placed, well-timed, and, depending on who's talking, dangerously ambitious daughters of the Boleyn family. Tonight, you move from Bessie Blount's gentle rise to the Boleyn sisters' dizzying ascent, and you're about to find out how tangled, glamorous, and downright cutthroat things get when ambition runs in the family. It's hard to overstate what a powder keg the Boleyns lit just by being there. Sir Thomas Boleyn, their father, was a diplomat with an impressive gift for survival, and their mother, Elizabeth Howard, came from one of the most ancient noble families in England. The girls, Mary and Anne, grew up in privilege, but not the kind that guarantees crowns. No one looked at the Boleyn sisters at age 10 and thought, ah, yes, future threats to the monarchy. But that's exactly what they became. First up, Mary. You meet her in 1520, fresh back from the glittering court of France, where she supposedly learned a few things about charm, subtlety, and the art of conversation with men who could end your family line on a whim. She arrives at Henry VIII's court with flushed cheeks, a musical laugh, and no idea she's about to become the king's mistress. Or maybe she does. That's part of the mystery. Mary Boleyn doesn't write letters filled with clever schemes or revolutionary declarations. She just shows up, says all the right things, and boom, Henry notices. Suddenly, she's dining at the king's table. She's riding in the same hunts. She's mentioned in court poems with coded flattery. And of course, she vanishes from the historical spotlight just as quickly as she entered. But not before two children are born, Catherine and Henry. And here's where the real scholarly wrestling match begins. Some historians believe Henry VIII fathered one or both of Mary's children. Others insist it was her husband, William Carey, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber. There are no definitive answers, just the quiet, gnawing possibility that Henry VIII may have had not one but two illegitimate children with Mary, and left both unacknowledged. And then comes Anne. She enters like a match tossed into the dry brushwood. Not traditionally beautiful, at least not by Tudor standards, but magnetic, in the way women who know their own mind often are. Sharp eyes, sharper wit, she doesn't charm with a sweetness like Mary. She entrances with mystery, intellect, and the ability to say no, like it's a spell. When Anne arrives at court, she's already learned from her sister's experience. She knows what happens when a girl says yes too soon, so she doesn't. Henry's used to getting what he wants, and Anne says no, again and again, politely, flirtatiously, maddeningly. It drives him absolutely wild. What begins as a casual flirtation warps into obsession. He writes her letters, steamy, emotional, embarrassingly earnest letters, begging her to be his. And here's the thing, Annie doesn't want to be just another mistress. She wants security. She wants influence. She wants more. Maybe even a crown. For the first time, you see a royal mistress shape not just the king's heart, but the policies of a nation. Anne's presence begins to infect everything. Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, his relationship with Rome, the stability of the entire kingdom. Whispers turn to roars. Parliament stirs. The Pope refuses to grant a divorce. Anne holds her ground. It's no longer just a love affair. It's a national crisis. While all this unfolds, you have to imagine Mary watching from the sidelines. She's married again now to a man far below her in status, and she's quietly falling out of favour while her sister rises like a storm cloud. There's real tension between them. Some accounts suggest jealousy, others imply pity. One sister plays the game by the rules and loses. The other breaks the game entirely and rewrites the board. Eventually Anne becomes queen. You already know how this ends, heads and axes and treason trials. But tonight we're not there yet. We're still in the firework moment, when Anne Boleyn, former lady-in-waiting, former flirtation, former mistress, is now England's crowned queen. It's unprecedented, terrifying, a bold leap across class and gender lines, but she didn't get there alone. Here's a fringe fact that rarely makes it into the soap opera versions. Anne had a network. Her mother, her brother George, reformist allies, even foreign ambassadors helped construct the scaffolding of her rise. She wasn't just navigating court politics, she was practically orchestrating them. And in that way, the Boleyn sisters weren't just figures in a romance, they were architects of a seismic shift. And scholars still can't agree on what to do with that. Was Anne a proto-feminist icon, wielding her agency in a world built to strip it away? Or was she a master manipulator who used desire as a lever and toppled an entire nation into religious and political chaos? Again, the answer slips through your fingers, changing shape depending on who you ask. Maybe that's what makes her so unforgettable. For you, standing in the echo of it all, it's the duality of the Boleyn sisters that sticks. Mary, who gave the king what he wanted and was discarded. Anne, who denied him, and was crowned, only to fall even harder. Two sisters, two approaches. Same king, same court, completely different fates. And in the rush of silk and scandal you start to see a pattern emerge, one that future mistresses will try to follow or avoid. Say yes too early and you disappear, say no too long and you risk everything. But if you time it just right, you might change the world. You walk with Mary Boleyn now, not the legendary Anne's sister, not the one written off in the margins, but Mary herself, and the quiet shadow she never really escaped. Everyone knows her name, of course, it's always paired with Anne's, always second, always the other Boleyn girl. But tonight you press in closer, past the simplifications, and find a woman who lived the full Tudor experience. Adored, discarded, married, widowed, remarried, and always underestimated. When you first meet Mary, she's laughing. Not the nervous, high-pitched giggle of a court girl trying to charm her way through a tense moment, but something deeper, freer. She's in France then, part of Queen Mary Tudor's entourage on her brief, ill-fated marriage to Louis XII. And while the Queen's life turns bitter quickly, Mary finds something entirely different. Education, experience, possibly even scandal. The French court is decadent and loose with its affections. People still whisper that Mary became the mistress of the new king, Francois I, while she was there. He allegedly called her his English mare, which, is as gross and sexist as it sounds. Whether true or not, by the time Mary returns to England, She's already worn the label of experienced, and that doesn't fade easily in Tudor society. So when she enters the English court again, people look at her with suspicion and a touch of judgment. But that doesn't stop Henry VIII from noticing her. Their affair begins discreetly. You imagine her at a court masque, candlelight flickering against her chestnut hair, her eyes catching the king's across the crowd, a few dances, a private dinner, and then, before long, she's elevated. Mary is now the king's mistress. Her family rises with her, basking in the warmth of royal attention. For the Boleyns, it's a promising start. For Mary, it's a trap. The thing about being the king's mistress, especially in the early 1520s, is that there's no script for what happens next. You don't get a title, you don't get an estate, you get rumours, you get the occasional gift, a flattering mention in court poetry, maybe even a small portrait. But more often than not, you get forgotten, and Mary is no exception. Before long, Henry grows bored, or maybe distracted. He moves on. Mary, like so many before her, is married off to William Carey, a respectable courtier with enough status to make the whole thing look polished. The wedding happens quickly, no fanfare, the message is clear, she's served her purpose. But here's where things get complicated. Mary gives birth to 2 children, Catherine in 1524 and Henry in 1526. The timing lines up just a little too neatly with her affair with the king, and while Henry VIII never acknowledges either child as his own, whispers fly through the court. Did he have 2 illegitimate children with Mary Boleyn? Is little Henry Carey actually a royal bastard hidden in plain sight? Historians still did argue over this. There's no firm proof, just a cluster of circumstantial evidence and that delicious Tudor ambiguity. What is known is that both children go on to live interesting lives. Catherine becomes a lady-in-waiting. Henry Carey ends up as Baron Hunsdon and is showered with favour under Queen Elizabeth I, his possible cousin or half-sister, depending on which theory you believe. Either way, Mary's children stay close to the crown, even if their mother does not. Because while Anne is ascending like a flame, Mary is slipping into silence. Her husband, William Carey, dies suddenly of sweating sickness in 1528, and Mary, now a widow with 2 children and very little money, is forced to ask her powerful family for help. Anne, not yet queen but firmly in Henry's favour, agrees to support her. But there's tension now, sharp and unmistakable. Mary has become inconvenient. She's no longer useful. Worse, she's unpredictable. And then she does something truly unforgivable by Tudor standards. She falls in love, not with a noble, not with a foreign diplomat. With a soldier, William Stafford, a nobody in the eyes of the court, a man with no lands, no title, and no political value. And Mary marries him in secret. When the Boleyns find out, they're furious. Anne, now the soon-to-be queen, is humiliated. The family cuts Mary off entirely. She's banished from court. Exiled not for scandal, she's already been a royal mistress, but for marrying without permission, without strategy, without gain. It's one of the most quietly radical acts in Tudor history. Mary Boleyn, once mistress to the most powerful man in the realm, walks away from all of it to marry for love, and she pays for it. She lives out the rest of her days in relative obscurity, far from the intrigues of court, far from her sister's rise, and eventually her fall. There's something haunting about that. When Anne is imprisoned in the Tower, waiting for her execution, there's no record of Mary visiting. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe she wouldn't. Maybe she'd seen enough of the crown's poison to know when to stay away. And yet, in the end, Mary survives, quietly, completely. She dies in 1543 at around 43 years old. No grand funeral, no monuments, just a footnote in the family record. And still, her blood continues in the veins of the powerful. Her children rise, thrive, become fixtures of the Elizabethan court. Here's a fringe little twist for you. In the 20th century, historians confirm that Mary Boleyn is an ancestor of both Winston Churchill and Princess Diana, which means that, through her, the modern British royal family descends from the forgotten Boleyn. Not Anne, Mary. You let that settle, because it's kind of perfect, isn't it? The quiet one, the sidelined one, the other one. She outlives them all, not in drama, but in legacy. While Anne burns like a comet and disappears, Mary drifts softly through the generations, her influence hiding in plain sight, and that's the danger of underestimating the shadows. Sometimes they outlast the flame. You stand in the throne room just off to the side, barely breathing. It's not your place to make eye contact, but tonight everyone is stealing glances. The air is thick with something electric. More than ceremony, more than pageantry. Because Anne Boleyn is no longer the king's mistress, she's the queen. And that changes everything. You've seen mistresses before? Of course, charming, clever, temporary. Their power always had an expiration date stamped silently on it. But Anne, she did what no mistress had done before. She rewrote the job description. She turned a flirtation into a war, seduction into reform, and desire into policy. She didn't just step into the Queen's shoes. She took them by force, broke the heels off, and strutted down the aisle of history wearing them like weapons. It's 1533, and you're in the heart of Henry VIII's court, and everything is trembling. The king has defied the Pope. England is slipping from Rome's grasp. And Anne, pregnant and radiant in her coronation robes, is paraded through the streets of London as the new queen. The crowds are split. Some cheer, either out of genuine loyalty or fear of being noticed not cheering. Others scowl, whispering words like witch or whore and usurper. Anne hears it all. She smiles anyway, but let's rewind, because the rise is just as brutal as the fall. Anne played her hand like a master. For 7 years, 7, she refused to sleep with Henry. She gave him her mind, her charm, her company, but not her body. That was her greatest weapon. And the king, spoiled and used to instant gratification, was reduced to pacing, begging, and writing letters filled with longing and terrible poetry. He offered her titles. She accepted the Marquessate of Pembroke. He promised marriage. She waited. All while the wheels of Europe groaned and turned behind them. When he finally broke from Rome and declared himself head of the Church of England, it wasn't just about love, it was about legacy. He needed a son. Catherine of Aragon hadn't given him one. Anne, unspoiled and brilliant, was his next bet. And when she became pregnant before the wedding, it was now or never. Henry made it official. She became queen, and the whole kingdom held its breath. But you feel it, don't you? That tension in the air, the kind that tells you this won't end quietly. Anne may have reached the top, but it's a treacherous place. Every step forward is into thin air. She's surrounded by enemies, loyalists to Catherine, noble families bitter over her family's sudden rise, clerics who think she's damned England to heresy. Even the people who supported her are watching closely now, asking silently, can she deliver? And then, the baby is born. It's a girl, Elizabeth. You hear the disappointment before it's even spoken aloud. Henry hides it poorly. Anne tries to smile, to claim divine timing. But the court knows what's been gambled. A girl isn't good enough. Not for all this chaos, not for a broken church and a humiliated queen cast aside. But Anne doesn't give up. She gets pregnant again and again. Miscarriages follow. One, reportedly, was a male child. Lost, perhaps, on the same day Henry begins flirting more openly with Jane Seymour, one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting. You can feel the shift starting again. Like a breeze before a storm. But here's what you don't expect, how deeply Anne believes in what she's doing. She isn't just clinging to power, she's reshaping England's very identity. She's a patron of reformers, a reader of banned texts, a woman who dares to speak her opinions in front of bishops and scholars. She fights for charity, for education. She insists her daughter Elizabeth be raised not just as a princess, but as a ruler. She may have started as a mistress, but she ends up as a visionary, and that's why her enemies come for her so hard. The campaign to destroy Anne isn't subtle. It's not even especially clever. Rumours of adultery, treason, incest even, with her own brother George. You try not to gag as you hear the accusations. The same court that once applauded her every word now snickers at her downfall. Evidence is weak, testimony is manipulated, but it doesn't matter. The verdict was decided before the trial began. You're there, in the tower, the night before her execution. She prays aloud, her voice steady. She speaks kindly of the king who signed her death warrant. And when she climbs the scaffold on May 19th, 1536, she does so in a dress of deep royal red. Her speech is graceful, she asks for mercy for the king, she kneels, the sword falls, it's over, just like that. But is it? Because Anne's story doesn't end with her death. Her daughter Elizabeth will one day rise to the throne and become one of the most iconic monarchs in British history. And everything Elizabeth becomes, sharp, decisive, learned, powerful, feels like a living echo of her mother. Still, scholars bicker. Was Anne a victim or a villain? a martyr of patriarchy or a cunning manipulator who simply flew too close to the sun. Some say she was Henry's pawn, others say he was hers. But one thing they agree on, Anne Boleyn wasn't just another mistress. She changed the game. She made the job dangerous, ambitious, and potentially deadly. You exhale slowly, because this wasn't just court gossip. It was a full-on revolution, all sparked by a woman who dared to say no until it became a yes that changed the course of history. And as you walk back out into the echoing stone corridor, you realise something chilling. The most powerful position a woman could hold in Tudor England wasn't queen, it was mistress, just long enough to make the king break the world. You pull up a chair in the great hall, maybe a little too close to the fire, where your gown starts to smell faintly of smoke and roasted meat. Around you, nobles murmur over goblets of wine, and beneath the polished chatter, there's always one question simmering. Was it love? Because when you look at the court of Henry VIII, the gifts, the letters, the long glances across banquets, you start to wonder whether all this royal romance was ever real, or just survival with better outfits. Tonight, you're sorting through the lies we call courtly love. The poems, the lockets, the sonnets penned by candlelight in a room you're technically not supposed to be in. At first glance, it all seems hopelessly romantic, but as you lean in closer, you realise nothing at Tudor court is done without calculation, and love is no exception. You see it start with the young girls, barely out of childhood, raised to believe that love and marriage are not intertwined. Love is a luxury, maybe, but marriage is politics, and so affection, real, messy, irrational love, has to find another outlet. That's where courtly love comes in, a game of pretend, a theatre of longing. The woman is placed on a pedestal, unreachable, adored from a distance. The man pines, writes poetry, offers tokens of devotion. It's romantic in theory, but hollow in practice, and dangerous, because eventually someone steps over the line. A glance lasts a bit too long, a hand brushes against silk just a second too soon. Suddenly it's not a game anymore. Suddenly someone's pregnant, or someone's ruined, or someone's mysteriously reassigned to a quiet countryside manor where no one ever sees them again. You watch Henry VIII play this game with terrifying ease. He knows the moves. The ring gifted at a joust. The private masque where he's dressed as a knight and the chosen lady is rescued from her seat. It's staged. It's orchestrated. But it works, at least for a while, until it doesn't. Because when the king chooses you, it is no longer pretend, it's real and it's terrifying. There are no clear rules for being the king's favourite. One day you're handed a jewelled necklace. The next, your cousin is arrested for blinking too slowly near a Spanish ambassador. The same love that lifts you to the highest tower can also push you off it. Still, there are those women who think they can manage it, who want to, women who study how to move across a room just so. Who understand that one meaningful pause before a curtsy might matter more than 10 flattering words. Some write music, some embroider messages in their sleeves. You once saw a lady arrange her hair into a subtle H-shaped braid at a hunt. It worked. She was invited to dine with the king 3 nights later. And then there are the gifts. Oh, the gifts. You think your ex giving you a hoodie was meaningful? Try getting a castle. Or a sapphire-encrusted prayer book with your initials etched into the clasp. You touch one, dusty and forgotten in a side gallery, and wonder how many hands it passed through before being locked away like a secret. These weren't just tokens of affection, they were markers of possession. You were claimed. If someone else tried to claim you, things could get ugly. Let's talk about the jewellery. Tudor jewellery didn't just sparkle, it spoke. Lovers exchanged rings with hidden inscriptions, often in Latin or French, heart pendants that opened to reveal miniature portraits. Lockets that clicked shut with locks shaped like flames. And yes, men wore them too, sometimes hiding a lover's image under their doublet, close to the chest. Sounds romantic, right? Until you realise that if your rival wears the same one, it means the king's moved on and didn't even bother to change gifts. Now it's just a regifted betrayal hanging from your neck. Then there are the letters. If you're lucky enough to find yourself near the king's writing desk after midnight, you might catch him bent over parchment, pen scratching furiously as he tries to find new ways to say, "I'm obsessed with you, please don't sleep with anyone else." Henry's love letters to Anne Boleyn still exist. They're clumsy, desperate, embarrassingly intense, and no one knows how they survived. Someone must have hidden them, kept them, maybe Anne herself, maybe a maid who understood their value. It's oddly comforting to realise that even kings get a little weird when they're infatuated. But what about the mistresses themselves? Were they falling in love? Some did, maybe. Or maybe they convinced themselves they had to. Because love in Tudor England isn't just dangerous, it's also currency. If the king believes you love him, that's leverage. If he thinks you're just there for power or status, that's risk. So the smartest women walk the line. They give just enough to keep his interest, but never enough to lose their balance. There's a quiet tragedy in all of it. You watch one lady, young, glowing, full of hope, read a poem left on her bed. It's unsigned, but everyone knows it's from the king. Her cheeks flush. She fingers the edge of the paper for hours. A week later, she's reassigned to her family's estate. Another woman has caught his eye. The poem stays folded in her jewellery box for the rest of her life. And here's the scholarly debate we can't escape. Was all this courtly love just an elaborate mask for predation? Were women coerced into these performances? Were they seduced or simply cornered into submission? Some argue the whole system was built to veil exploitation in the glitter of poetry. Others insist that women learned to wield the system to their benefit, that they became fluent in its double meanings, its feints, its carefully curated blushing. And maybe both are true. Maybe it was manipulative, and maybe it was also the only language women had to express power, without being punished for it. The rules were never written for them, but some still learned how to win. You sit back in your creaky chair, wine forgotten, as another mask begins. Costumes swirl, music hums, and masked dancers flirt through candlelight like it's all some ancient game. You know better now. Behind every fluttered fan and every coy glance is a calculation. A risk. A gamble. Because love in the Tudor court isn't about hearts and flowers. It's about strategy and survival dressed up in verse. You step into the Queen's antechamber, where everything looks delicate. Lace pillows, carved ivory combs, fine Flemish tapestries. But none of it feels safe. Because here, among the painted smiles and artful embroidery, a different language is being spoken. Not Latin, not French. It's the subtle dialect of glances and gestures, whispers and silences. Tonight, you're learning the secret language of royal mistresses, the one they used when words could kill and truth was more dangerous than a dagger. You don't get a uniform, being the king's mistress. There's no sash, no crest, no official declaration. But there are signs. You just have to know where to look. The first thing you notice is the fabric. Richer than any maid of honour should afford, colours just bold enough to catch the eye, but never so loud as to cause suspicion. A gown with gold thread along the cuffs. A French hood tipped slightly forward to veil the eyes. These are not accidents. There are signals. Mistresses learn to dress not just for beauty, but for coded messaging. Blue for fidelity, but a deeper navy could suggest something more private, more intimate. Crimson for courage, yes, but also for passion, blood, and royal favour. Pearls, always pearls, worn in even numbers. 2 for secrecy, 4 for protection. Anne Boleyn famously wore a necklace with a dangling bee and 3 pearls. The letter was obvious. The number. That's where it gets interesting. Some say it symbolised herself, her sister Mary, and the Queen. 3 women who'd all shared the same king. You notice the fans next. The way a woman holds hers can say more than her mouth ever could. A slow wave to the left? Yes, I saw him, held tightly closed and lowered. Not here, not now. Dropped intentionally a summons. You catch one girl at a banquet drop her fan twice in a single evening. By morning, she's been moved to a more favourable room in the palace. She never says a word about it. The language of flowers also blooms around you. Courtiers pass nosegays, small bundles of herbs and blossoms, tucked into gloves, sleeves, or the binding of a prayer book. A rose for love, rosemary for remembrance, lavender for suspicion. You spot a maid-in-waiting reading a cluster of violets and marjoram like it's a love letter. In a way it is. Gifts too speak volumes. The king can't just say, "You're my mistress," in public, so he gives. Not just diamonds or land, but more personal tokens. An illuminated psalter with initials woven into vines, a hand-carved lute, a miniature portrait on vellum, hidden in a locket no bigger than a walnut. Some are innocuous enough to pass inspection by the Queen's ladies. Others are so specific they make you wonder how many people really understand what's being exchanged. One fringe item you stumble across is a pomander ball, an ornate filigree sphere worn on a chain or tucked in a girdle, filled with fragrant herbs to ward off illness. But these aren't just for health. Some women carried pomanders inscribed with secret mottos on the inside, tiny prayers or promises etched so small they could only be read with a glass. One, belonging to a lesser-known mistress, bore the phrase tout mon cœur, all my heart. It was never addressed, never acknowledged, but it was passed to her daughter when she died. Language in the Tudor court isn't just spoken, it's embroidered, composed, posed, and choreographed. A tilt of the head, a smirk mid-curtsy, a brush of fingers against the king's as you pass a goblet. Each movement is loaded, especially under the weight of 100 watching eyes. Of course, this also means the Queen speaks in code. She must. If the mistress offers flirtation, the Queen offers guidance, controlled regal hours. The Queen might accept a lady's curtsy with a colder nod than usual, or request that her maid wear simpler gowns, or ask about her health with a tone so sweet it's almost suspicious. If the Queen calls you dear child, you're probably doomed. In the background, jesters and fools often serve as couriers. It's their job to speak truths wrapped in humour, which means they can comment on flirtations and tensions others must pretend not to notice. You once hear one say, better a king's favour than his fury unless they come together. Everyone laughs, no one forgets it. Even dances become battlegrounds of coded expression. In the Galliard, for example, the number of turns a man invites a lady to take can signal interest. But when a king dances 3 times with the same woman in one night, everyone in the room reads it as a declaration. You see it happen once, and the woman is sent back to her father's estate within a week. Too bold, too fast. Now, not every mistress learns this language quickly. Some crash into it like birds into stained glass. They smile too brightly, speak too loudly, forget which flower means secrecy and which means betrayal. Those women become cautionary tales, their names whispered in the same breath as warnings. Don't be like her. But the truly skilled ones, the ones who last, they speak in silence. You'll pass them in a hallway and swear nothing happened, until your own fortunes start to change. A rival finds her gown stained. A promised marriage falls through. A letter never arrives. Power is exercised without ever being seen. That's the heart of it. Royal mistresses didn't just seduce, they signalled. They navigated a court so rife with traps and hidden blades that speaking plainly was practically suicidal, so they created their own language, a silent, essential dialect carved out of necessity. And even centuries later, historians are still decoding it. Some scholars argue that this elaborate form of communication was actually empowering, a covert code that allowed women to exert control in a world that denied them open authority. Others believe it was simply another layer of manipulation, designed to keep women compliant under the illusion of agency. As always, it's both, a performance and a rebellion, a trap and an escape. You stand in front of a portrait now, one of those oil-rich ones where the subject's eyes seem to follow you. She's expressionless, hands folded, but you can't help but notice her jewellery, ruby and pearl, arranged like teardrops. Her fan is opened slightly, her eyes tilted to the left. Her message, centuries old, still whispers. You're not just looking at a woman, you're reading her. You hesitate at the edge of the privy chamber, your fingertips grazing the carved wood of the doorway. And already you feel it. The heat of proximity to power, the strange pressure that builds when secrets multiply behind closed doors. This isn't the throne room or the chapel or even the Queen's apartments. No, the privy chamber is something else entirely. It's the king's inner sanctum, the place where politics and personal pleasure blur so completely you wonder if there was ever a line between them to begin with. If court life is a theatre, then this is backstage, where the real story unfolds. And tonight, you're about to linger in the long, candlelit corridors of scandal. Because in Henry VIII's court, nearly every whisper of sex, gossip and betrayal leads back here, to the rooms just beyond the public eye, where only a chosen few are allowed and even fewer survive. You step inside, careful not to speak. The chamber is quieter than expected, warm from the always burning hearth, and thick with the scent of wine, sweat and beeswax. It's not just one room but a cluster, bedchamber, study, dressing room and more. It's where the king dines privately, where he's dressed, read to, entertained, flattered and of course seduced. The men who serve him here, grooms of the stool, gentlemen of the privy chamber, are more powerful than most lords. They handle everything from royal bowel movements to political counsel. It's gross, yes, but it's also intimate, uncomfortably so. you start to notice patterns. Mistresses don't always enter through the grand halls. They're escorted here discreetly, often under the guise of reading or music lessons. A young woman with a lute, a softly spoken maid carrying a tray, a cousin of a courtier with a clever joke. They aren't officially summoned, they're invited. And once they're inside, the rules change. Because here, the king isn't just a ruler. He's a man. Tired, impulsive, hungry for distraction, and that's where scandal finds fertile ground. Take Jane Seymour, for example. Before she became queen, she was just another lady in waiting. But where Anne Boleyn dazzled with her sharpness, Jane wielded silence like a scalpel. You imagine her walking through the privy chamber, eyes cast down, voice barely audible. Henry was drawn to her quietness after Anne's fiery storms. It wasn't long before he was slipping her gifts, purses embroidered with coins, fine linens. She refused them, or at least pretended to. That's what hooked him. The resistance, the suggestion of virtue. Jane wasn't seducing him, she was saving herself. For him, at least that's how it looked from the outside. Then there's Catherine Howard, Anne Boleyn's cousin, who enters the Privy Chamber at 17, naive and glowing with youth. She becomes the king's 5th wife, but before that she's the court's worst-kept secret. Stories swirl of moonlit meetings and galleries, of flirtations that edge too close to treason. After her death, beheaded for adultery, people whispered that it all began here, in these rooms, where supervision blurred and consequences felt distant. And it wasn't just mistresses who spun the web of scandal. The men were just as tangled. Ambassadors eavesdropped, servants gossiped, letters were stolen, forged and misdelivered. A compliment said too loudly could start a war. A glance seen by the wrong person could end a career. You hear of one noblewoman who smiled too brightly at the king during a card game. The next morning she found herself accused of impropriety and conveniently removed from court before her family could gain any real influence. It's not always about sex, of course. Sometimes it's about power disguised as pleasure. The king's favour is currency and the privy chamber is the bank vault. A woman who catches his eye might sway decisions on land grants, pensions or diplomatic appointments. A man who arranges a chance meeting between his cousin and the king might find himself elevated. You begin to understand that court scandal isn't a side effect of power, it's one of its primary ingredients. Let's not forget the letters. They're everywhere, hidden in sleeves, tucked into prayer books, exchanged in books of hours with hollowed-out pages. One account tells of a note wrapped inside a sugared fig. Another was sewn into the hem of a gown. You hear about a miniature portrait of a woman's face gifted to the king that opened to reveal a lock of hair, hidden behind the paint like a secret breathing under the surface. There's a famous case that turns your stomach a little. One of Henry's brief favourites, so fleeting her name's nearly lost, was caught laughing behind a curtain in the privy chamber with a married courtier. No one saw what happened, but that didn't matter. Rumour was enough, within days she was gone. Her father was stripped of lands, her name erased from the records, as if she'd never existed. Her biggest mistake? Forgetting that the Privy Chamber doesn't forgive carelessness. There's a reason historians still argue about what really happened behind these walls. Records are spotty, names get blurred. No one wrote down, "On this day the king took a new mistress." It wasn't polite, but you can read between the lines. The sudden promotions, the new gowns, the rare jewels that appear out of nowhere. Scandal doesn't need a paper trail, it leaves its mark on people instead. Some scholars argue the Privy Chamber was a crucible of corruption, where power was abused under the excuse of privacy. Others claim it was the one place the king could be human, not just a monarch trapped in ritual. But most agree on one thing: whatever happened in those rooms shaped the course of English history more than most council meetings ever did. You sit quietly now. In the corner of this invisible battlefield, the laughter of courtiers echoing down the hall. Every scandal that ever broke out here left ripples, through families, titles, marriages, and always someone paid the price, usually the woman, always the quieter one, and yet they kept stepping inside. You find her name tucked between the more dramatic entries buried in a genealogical chart like a footnote no one expects you to read. Elizabeth, Bessie, Darrell. There's no portrait. No scandalous poetry, no famous sister to give her a Netflix adaptation. But make no mistake, Bessie was there, at court, in the chambers, in the king's bed, and tonight you follow her into the quiet corners of Tudor history where the forgotten mistresses drift like shadows behind the stars of the show. It's easy to forget that Henry VIII didn't only entertain the flashy, the dangerous, the Anne Boleyns of the world. There were others, many others. And Bessie Darrell, soft-spoken and largely overlooked, is your keyhole into a whole network of women who occupied the strange, whisper-filled role of royal mistress without ever becoming famous or infamous. You start with what little we know. Bessie was the daughter of a respected Gloucestershire family, the Darrells, loyal enough to the crown to be trusted but not ambitious enough to be threatening. It's likely she came to court in her mid-teens as part of a noble household, maybe as a companion or maid of honour. Somewhere along the way she caught the king's attention, not in a blaze of glory, but more like a flicker of warmth. And unlike with Anne or Mary Boleyn, there were no fireworks, no poems written in desperation, no grand banquets with her seated suspiciously close to the king, just quiet favour, occasional gifts, time spent with Henry when he wasn't fighting Parliament or dealing with the ever-growing fallout of his religious reformation. Maybe that's why it lasted as long as it did, because she didn't demand more. One of the most compelling details: she gave birth to a son, Henry Fitz-Edward, or possibly named Henry Darrell, depending on which local records you believe. Not officially acknowledged, of course. Henry VIII only recognised one illegitimate child publicly, Henry Fitzroy, son of Elizabeth Blount. But the timing, the location, and the proximities to the king all line up. And while there's no grand declaration of Bessie and her son were given an estate, a quiet one, well-funded, well-staffed, the kind of place where you send people you want to keep comfortable and quiet. You walk through that estate now, the fire burning low, the tapestries faded but still rich. A carved cradle sits in the corner. Bessie raises her child here, not as a future king but as a hidden chapter. Occasionally the court sends letters, occasionally the king sends money. But there are no visits, no royal tutors, just enough attention to suggest a connection and enough distance to deny it outright. And here's what makes Bessie's story haunting. She wasn't alone. For every Anne Boleyn who clawed her way to power, there were a dozen Bessies, girls from noble but more minor families. Educated enough to hold a conversation, pretty enough to catch a glance, clever enough to survive without drawing too much attention. They don't show up in the plays or the novels. Their portraits are unsigned, if they exist at all. But their influence, however quiet, shaped the tone of the court. You learn that Bessie was given a pension for life, an unusual move for a woman who officially held no royal position. She wasn't a widow of a great lord, she hadn't served the Queen directly. But the money came all the same. Some scholars suggest it was hush money, others say it was gratitude. You can't help but think it was both. There's a fringe theory about women like Bessie, one whispered among Tudor scholars with a touch of reverence, that the king needed mistresses like her, that between the volatile queens and the ambitious favourites he craved moments of peace. Bessie didn't challenge his ego. She didn't press him for promises. She just existed. Affection without complication, which, in a court where every interaction was a potential landmine, must have felt like a balm. And still her legacy is barely a ripple. After her death, the estate passed quietly to her son, who in turn became a gentleman of some minor standing. No scandal, no dramatic fall, just a fading line on a family tree. She's not mentioned in Henry's biographies. Her name doesn't appear in court records after a certain point. It's as if she was gently erased. Not out of shame, but out of convenience. You sit with that for a moment, because there's something strange about a woman who existed at the very heart of royal power, who bore the king's child, and was then allowed to disappear gracefully. No tower, no scandal, no tragic poetry, just silence. It leads you to wonder how many others there were. Women whose names were never written down or deliberately written over, who were paid off, married off, or sent away. Maybe some of them didn't even realise they were part of history. Maybe they thought it was just a fleeting moment, a conversation that turned into a kiss that turned into a child who grew up knowing he bore a jawline a bit too royal. The debate is endless. Were women like Bessie victims of a predatory system? Or were they savvy survivors who took what they could in a world where options were limited? The truth, frustratingly, lives in the grey area. Some were likely manipulated, others perhaps knew exactly what they were doing, and most lived somewhere between strategy and surrender. But tonight you remember Bessie Darrell's this, not because she changed the course of English history, but because she represents all the women who didn't, but were still there, watching, waiting, loving, leaving. Forgotten not because they lacked importance, but because their stories weren't loud enough for the history books to bother with. You pass her room again on your way back through the mental corridors of the long, flickering palace. There's no noise, just a faint scent of rose oil and paper. A cradle. A name that may or may not be the king's, and a legacy built not in fire, but in quiet flame. You're standing just off the edge of the Queen's chamber now, between two fluted columns carved with trailing vines and Tudor roses, watching a line of young women file through like gilded ghosts. They're all wearing matching gowns in pale silks, their hair tucked neatly under French hoods, their eyes darting everywhere but the king. These are the maids of honour, decorative, obedient, and deadly. Tonight you follow one of them, not to her embroidery frame or her prayer book, but to the razor-thin line she walks between service to her queen and temptation by her king, because being a maid of honour wasn't just about etiquette, it was about proximity, and proximity, in Tudor England, could get you everything, or take it all away. You meet her near the chapel where she's adjusting her gloves and reciting a psalm from memory, not because she's especially pious, but because someone is always listening. Her name's Joan, or Margaret, or Elizabeth. It doesn't matter. What matters is where she stands. A few careful steps behind the Queen, just close enough for the king to notice when she bends to pick up a dropped handkerchief or smiles at a misplaced compliment. It's her job to be useful, invisible, and charming all at once, which is a special kind of impossible. By day she helps dress the Queen, assists with letters, arranges the flowers. By night, she's performing in court masks and standing subtly during feasts, her hand folded neatly, her mouth shut. But beneath the layers of satin and obedience something shifts, because she knows, as all the maids of honour do, that she's being watched. Not just by the king, but by the entire court. That's how it begins. A brief glance across the hall, a shared joke about the music, then one night a note, folded small, tucked inside her prayer book. No signature, but unmistakably from him. The king. Your heart races with hers. This is the moment. She could burn it. She could show it to the Queen and earn loyalty for life, or she could read it and respond. What people forget is how calculated all of this is. Becoming a royal mistress isn't a spontaneous act of passion. It's a series of tiny choices, each one sharper than the last. The maid of honour understands that once she opens that door, she can never close it again. But she also understands what waits on the other side. Jewellery, influence, land, a future outside the narrow of marriage. Her family arranged when she was 8. Maybe even a title. Still the risks are as sharp as the rewards. You remember Catherine Howard, barely more than a girl when she was pulled into Henry's attention. She was just another maid of honour, placed there, as it turns out, intentionally from the ambitious Duchess of Norfolk. A pawn, dressed and perfumed, packaged for the king's taste. Her rise was quick, her fall was quicker. But this isn't Catherine, not yet. This is the one before her, or the one after. The girl who manages to hold the king's interest just long enough to be noticed, but not long enough to be dangerous. It's a masterclass in balance. She makes him laugh. She's just flirtatious enough to keep him chasing. But she never oversteps, not in public, not where the Queen can see. You hear rumours swell faster than they can be suppressed. The Queen's ladies are whispering. The other maids watch her with narrowed eyes. Some are envious, others are terrified. Because the closer she gets to the king, the further she steps from the safety of anonymity. She's no longer just a maid of honour. She's a potential mistress, a possible threat, a rival. Then comes the testing phase. She's invited to a private hunt, a small dinner, a midnight walk in the garden. She never goes alone. That would be improper. But she does go, and each time she returns with a new ribbon or a necklace or a book. The Queen says nothing, but her silence is a scream. It's easy to think of these women as powerless, swept along by the will of the king, but you know better now. They're not helpless. They're navigating a system that leaves no room for direct agency, and so they play the angles. Some flirt for survival, others for revenge, some, rarely, because they actually like him. But most understand the reality. If the king notices you, your life changes. If he touches you, it's never the same again. One fringe story sticks with you. A maid of honour who was gifted a partridge by the king, roasted and glazed, with a note hidden inside. She shared it with another maid as a joke, not realising the note had been seen by a servant. Within the week she was dismissed. Not for the note, not even for the partridge, but for laughing too loudly near the wrong person. Another rumour tells of a girl who refused the king outright, not rudely. Just firmly, she was married off within days to a knight twice her age and banished to the north. The message was clear. No one says no to the king, not without consequences, but there were exceptions. Women who rose through that role, mistress, then wife, or at least respectable retirement. Jane Seymour again, Anne Boleyn disastrously. The line between elevation and execution was as thin as a veil, and still they lined up. Family ambition played a part. Mothers and aunts whispered advice in corners, fathers wrote hopeful letters. A daughter at court was a chance, and if she became a favourite, everything changed. The family gained lands, titles, security. One girl's favour could lift 10 generations, or ruin them. Historians still fight over how to categorise these women. Were they exploited? Were they complicit? Were they somehow both? You watch this maid of honour navigate her fate with more intelligence than anyone gives her credit for. She isn't just surviving, she's performing, reacting, manipulating when she can. She's painfully aware of what she's risking. But in a world where her worth is measured in dowries and bloodlines, at least here, for a moment, she's seen. Eventually her name fades from court gossip. A new girl arrives. The king grows restless again. Your maid is married off, not poorly, not brilliantly. She leaves court with a heavy necklace and an even heavier heart. People whisper her name for a season. Then silence. But you remember her, because she shows you what it really meant to be a mistress of power, not a title, but a role, a job, a performance on a knife's edge. And sometimes the best players were the ones who left the stage early, alive. You're pressed against a cold stone wall in the outer gallery now, pretending to study a tapestry while your ears are busy doing something far more dangerous, listening. Because in Tudor England, power doesn't just flow from the throne or the altar. It lives in whispers, in knowing glances, in the low hum of gossip passed like contraband beneath veils and behind fans. Tonight, you slip into the invisible web that bound the court together. Tudor gossip. Networks, where the fate of a mistress could turn on a single misplaced syllable. It starts with the ladies in waiting. Always them. They're the queens of information, positioned at the crossroads of every room. Trained to look like they're not paying attention while absorbing every detail with hawk-like precision. They speak in half-sentences and meaningful silences. If the king has taken a new favourite, they know. If a rival has been dismissed to the countryside, for health, they've already guessed the scandal. And they don't hoard these details. They trade them. You watch a pattern unfold over a single week. A new girl at court receives a bracelet. No inscription, but the king gave it to her himself. One of the queen's older ladies sees this and mentions it casually while playing cards with a French ambassador's wife. 2 days later, that same ambassador mentions the king's changing taste in his report back to France. By the weekend, the girl's family receives a discreet inquiry from a high-ranking courtier. Would their daughter be amenable to marriage abroad? The speed is terrifying, and that's just one rumour. Gossip is currency, and unlike gold, it multiplies the more it's passed around. But it's also a weapon. You hear it wielded by men in velvet doublets, whispering about a noblewoman's reputation before a key vote in Parliament. You see it drip from the lips of duchesses, who innocently ask why the new maid's family received land last month. You realise quickly that in the Tudor court, information is how wars are won and lost, without ever unsheathing a sword. The court fools and jesters are especially dangerous. Their job is to speak truths others can't, wrapped in rhyme, soaked in laughter. One jester tells a riddle about a bird who built a nest too close to the king's window. Everyone chuckles. No one misses the point. A new mistress has moved in too fast, too boldly, and soon she's gone, no punishment, just replaced. Spies too played their role, especially during the reigns of Henry's later queens. You hear stories of men paid to eavesdrop on servants or sneak through the corridors posing as scribes. One known agent, a laundress of all people, kept records of which linens came from which rooms, using perfume residue to trace where certain women had spent the night. It sounds absurd until you remember that evidence didn't have to be accurate, just believable. You catch wind of a fringe story. One courtier had a pet songbird trained to sing a specific tune every time a particular woman entered the room. At first, people thought it was charming. Then they realised the bird was always right. That woman was soon found to be the king's newest interest. Whether the bird was genuinely trained or the courtier simply kept it in the right spot at the right time doesn't matter. The damage was done, her favour was public, and when the king's attention drifted, so did hers, right into exile. But not all gossip was about scandal. Sometimes it was preemptive protection. You hear of one woman, a cousin to the Seymours, who was rumoured to have shared a carriage ride with the king. Within hours, she was weaving her own narrative. Devout, modest, loyal to the queen. Before anyone could paint her as ambitious, she cast herself as untouchable. She survived. Others weren't so lucky. Even foreign courts played the game. Ambassadors regularly traded intelligence on Henry's romantic interests, hoping to sway political negotiations. A rumoured affair could delay a treaty. Confirmed mistress from a certain noble house might ensure a better marriage for a foreign princess. One Venetian report famously listed the order of the king's passions, ranking women by beauty, virtue and fertility. Think of it as a Tinder profile curated by terrified diplomats. You notice how rumours about mistresses follow a pattern. First the whisper. He looked at her during supper. Then the confirmation. She wore his colours at the hunt. Then the reaction, gifts, visits, movement into better chambers. And then the backlash. Jealous rivals, furious queens, opportunistic relatives. Finally the fade, she's gone. Or worse, she stays too long. Scholars still debate the role gossip played in the collapse of Anne Boleyn. Was it truly a coordinated attack by Cromwell and his allies? Or did it begin with murmurs about flirtations turned into poison by repetition? You'll never know for sure. But it's clear that words, whispered in the right ears, were just as fatal as swords. There's a darker layer too. The women involved in these networks weren't just spreading gossip, they were protecting themselves. Information was armour. If you knew the king's preferences, you could flatter them. If you knew which noble was rising, you could attach yourself. If you knew which lady had slipped, you could avoid her fate, or seize her spot. One day you hear a girl laughing too loudly about something she overheard, a conversation about a duchess's rumoured illegitimacy. A week later, that duchess's brother is promoted, the laughing girl, married off to an obscure merchant and sent to Ireland. Message received, and yet the gossip never stops. You pass a maid who whispers something to a page, who passes it to a cook, who somehow tells a knight. You see it ripple outward at you like a pebble dropped in still water. No one knows where it started. Everyone thinks they know how it ends, but you do. It ends here, with you standing in a corridor you were never meant to enter, holding on to a secret that's probably already old news, and you wonder, not for the first time, if anyone at court truly knows what's real anymore. Because in the Tudor world, truth doesn't matter as much as belief. And gossip? Gossip is what people believe first and forget last. You step off the boat and your feet hit French soil, soft and unfamiliar under your shoes. The wind smells different here, less of English hearth smoke and more of perfume and spices. You're no longer in Henry's court, with its heavy shadows and sharper than they look courtesies. You've crossed the channel into a different kind of danger. Tonight, you follow the story of a royal mistress abroad, where flirtation and diplomacy are twin flames, and where the English girls who serve Gislined here learn their lessons early and deeply. Welcome to the French court, where the rules are looser, but the stakes are just as high. The French know how to stage a performance. That's clear the moment you walk into the Great Hall of Francis. The silk banners ripple from every column. Musicians fill the air with layers of harp and flute, and everywhere you look, there are women, gowned, powdered, painted, and impossibly self-aware. These are not girls hoping to catch a king's eye by accident, they're trained. French noblewomen are artists of conversation, dancers of reputation, and queens of implication. And some of the English maids who come here, they take notes. You meet Jane Popincourt first, a name you've probably never heard, but tonight you'll follow her like a thread through foreign velvet. She arrived at the French court in the late 1490s, originally as a tutor in languages and etiquette. She was meant to be respectable, invisible, and for a while she was, until she wasn't. Popincourt becomes known not just for her education, but for her ease with power. She moves through the court like a fish in water, catching glances, offering smiles, never staying too long in one conversation. Soon she's rumoured to be the mistress of Louis XII, not a formal title, those are rarely given, but enough gossip swirls to lift her from ordinary companion to courtly enigma. She walks a tightrope, balancing French favour with English caution, and she manages to stay aloft longer than anyone expects. And then, She disappears. Just like that, removed from court, replaced, sent away. No charges, no scandal, just gone. Her absence echoes louder than her presence ever did. But her influence lingers, because by the time Anne Boleyn and Mary Boleyn come to serve in the French court, some years later, the rules have shifted. The English girls know now that French flirtation is a tool, not a trap. They study the smiles, they master the dances. They begin to speak in double meanings and learn to read poetry like it's a weapon. And when they return to England, they bring that fire with them. Anne especially absorbs everything. At the French court, she learns that a woman's greatest strength isn't in beauty, it's in mystery, in wit, in knowing how to walk away just before a man thinks he's won. She watches the French courtesans with their calculated glances and half-exposed necklines and realises they aren't waiting for permission. They were creating space where none existed. She brings that lesson home. But let's step back. You're in a carriage now, travelling through the French countryside with a young English maid assigned to the Queen's retinue. She's 16. Her name doesn't matter. Let's call her Cecily. She's overwhelmed. She doesn't speak French well yet. She blushes too easily. But she's already being watched. A courtier has noticed her. A young prince asked her to dance. And somewhere in the back of her mind, Cecily knows that if she plays this well, her family might never worry about money again. The court teaches her how to walk more slowly, how to let her silence be interpreted as intelligence, how to dance the pavane with a hint of hesitation, so the men lean in to catch her rhythm. And she learns. Fast. Too fast. Within weeks. Cecily is being invited to private dinners. Her name is in letters to England. The ambassador warns her uncle that she is dangerously visible. But Cecily doesn't stop, because in this world, visibility is survival. You learn a fringe detail from one of the older ladies at court. French women sometimes wore rings with tiny compartments of perfume, not just to mask the smell of the court, but to distract, to entice. One mistress even dipped her gloves in orange blossom oil before each meeting, so her scent would linger on the king's fingers. The English girls borrow this trick. The scent of ambition, it turns out, is citrus and rosewater. And the question scholars still argue over, were these young women victims of French decadence? Or did they use their foreign education to carve out more power than they could ever gain back home? Did the French court corrupt them or liberate them? When Anne Boleyn returns to England after years abroad, she's not the same girl who left. She's sharper, quieter, more precise. Her gowns are sleeker, her language more refined. And when Henry starts to notice her, it's not because she throws herself at him, it's because she doesn't. She plays the French game, and she plays it well. Cecily, however, doesn't make it home. She's married off to a minor noble in Gascony, her name fading from English records. Her family receives a tidy dowry, her younger sister is sent to court in her place, and so the cycle continues. You start to understand that abroad isn't just a change of location, it's a forge. English girls who pass through the French court either return transformed or don't return at all. Some are broken, others become women the English court doesn't quite know how to handle. Too polished, too clever, too aware of their own value. And yet, when their names appear in letters and memoirs, they're often reduced to footnotes. She served abroad, a polite euphemism, everyone knows what it means. She learned to speak softly, walk like smoke, and play a dangerous game with a charming smile. Tonight, you leave France reluctantly, the echo of music still in your ears. You step back onto English soil changed, scented, sharpened. Because while English mistresses learned how to survive in the king's court, the best of them learned how to win in France. You hear it before you see it. The cry of a newborn, thin and desperate, echoing off stone walls that were never built for softness. The bedchamber smells of sweat and rosewater, and someone has opened a window to let in the late spring air, though it does little to mask the ache in the room. You're standing at the side of a royal mistress giving birth, not to a secret, not to a rumour, but to a child of the king, and now everything changes. Tonight, you witness one of the most dangerous and heartbreaking transitions a woman in the Tudor court could face, from mistress to mother of a royal bastard. You look down at the woman in bed. Her name is Joan, or Marjorie, or Alice. She is young, her hair plastered to her forehead, her hands still trembling from gripping the bedpost as the midwife urged her to push. The child is being washed now in a wooden basin lined with linen, inspected by a nurse and wrapped too tightly and swaddling. It's a boy, or a girl. Either way, the nurse doesn't smile. She doesn't need to. The importance of this moment isn't written on faces, it's written in inheritance. In bloodlines, in the tension that settles over the house the moment the birth is announced. If it's a boy, you can already hear the possibilities being calculated in whispered corridors. If it's a girl, there's still value, just not as much. Either way, a royal child born outside of marriage is both blessing and curse. It's proof of the king's virility, and it's proof of his infidelity. The mother knows this, lying there in the damp sheets. She's won a strange sort of prize, and it might just ruin her life. You think of Elizabeth Blount again, who gave birth to Henry Fitzroy in 1519. The king's only acknowledged illegitimate son. For a time, Fitzroy was adored, showered in titles, Duke of Richmond, Lord High Admiral. He had his own court, his own coat of arms. Some even whispered, seriously, that he might be legitimised, named up heir. But that future unravelled. Fitzroy died young, 17, likely of tuberculosis. All that promise, gone. And Blunt? She lived quietly afterward, married off respectably, but always remembered as the girl who almost changed everything. But most of these mothers, they don't get titles, they don't get remembered, they get sent away, they're paid. Sometimes married off to someone agreeable, someone willing to take on another man's child in exchange for a pension or a slice of land. Sometimes they vanish altogether. The king never visits. A wet nurse takes over. The court turns the page. You see one of these children now, toddling through a garden maze behind a country manor. His eyes are unmistakable, pale blue like the king's, but no one says it. He's being raised by his uncle, though the servants know better. He'll grow up surrounded by careful lies and subtle privileges, a tutor paid for by someone anonymous, a set of books stamped with the royal insignia, and when he's older, perhaps he'll be invited to court, but never officially. Never as a son. There's a fringe theory among Tudor scholars, one they pass around in footnotes and late-night academic conferences, that Henry VIII fathered more than a dozen illegitimate children. The names are speculative, the evidence circumstantial, but the pattern is there. Girls who disappeared for several months, boys who entered royal service with no known parentage but all the right connections, a gold ring slipped into a cradle, a royal crest engraved too lovingly. Enough smoke to suggest fire, even if no one will light the match. Of course the debate rages. Why did Henry only acknowledge Fitzroy? Was it pride? Politics? Was Fitzroy simply the only one he loved enough to claim? Or were there others who were kept secret, perhaps because they weren't politically convenient? One woman's child might tie Henry too closely to an enemy faction. Another might challenge the legitimacy of his lawful heirs. Better then to pretend they didn't exist. And then there's the mother herself, standing by the window now months after the birth. She's pale, thin. She watches the child play in the grass. A governess hovers nearby, careful but distant. The mother's gown is expensive but dated. She hasn't been to court in over a year. Her letters to the king go unanswered. The silence is her answer. You ache for her, but not just out of pity, out of admiration, because she knows what this all meant. She knew from the first whispered summons to the king's chamber what could happen. She took the risk anyway, maybe for her family, maybe because she didn't have a choice, maybe, just maybe, because she believed, even briefly, that he might love her. And now she has a child who bears a famous face and a forgotten name. Some of these children do well. They become knights, courtiers, soldiers. They marry well, or at least well enough. Others disappear into quiet parishes or foreign cities. Their parentage hinted at in dusty records, but never confirmed. The crown watches from afar, making sure no one gets too close to dangerous truth. You see a document once, half-burned, with a list of children attached to the court in some financial way, each one traced back to a mistress formerly favoured by the king. The names are vague, the amounts are small, but they're there, and they're real. And you realise something chilling. These children are living proof that history happened behind closed doors, that the crown was not just passed through marriage and bloodlines, but through passion and secrecy, through the bodies of women who were celebrated, then erased. But some part of them survives, in their children, in the shape of a chin, the fire in the eyes, the intelligence behind a smile. And while their names may never appear in the official histories, they echo in the margins, in the people who inherited their beauty, their wit, and their impossible place in the world. So the next time you pass a royal portrait and admire the regal cheekbones or the sly curl of a smile, pause. Ask yourself, Is that the face of a queen's child? Or a mistress's? You're walking across a quiet patch of countryside now, rolling green hills, hedgerows dotted with blackberries, and an estate house just coming into view on the horizon. It's peaceful, idyllic. The kind of place where history seems like something that happens to other people. But make no mistake, this isn't a retreat. It's a reward. Tonight you explore the golden parachutes of Tudor politics, property, titles and other apologies, the compensation given to mistresses once their usefulness had expired. Because the crown doesn't send flowers after a breakup, it sends land deeds. It starts with the gift. At first it's subtle, a necklace here, a bolt of fine fabric. A chest of coins delivered discreetly. It's not public, but it's known, a way of saying thank you without saying too much. Sometimes it's not even for the mistress herself, it's for her father or her brother or her soon-to-be husband. You see how favour trickles outward like oil across water. Entire families benefit from one well-timed romance. Take Elizabeth Blount again. After her time with Henry and the birth of Fitzroy, she was married off to Gilbert Taleboys, a respectable nobleman who suddenly found himself titled as Lord Taleboys of Kyme. Was he an ambitious opportunist or a convenient solution? Historians still argue, but the facts are clear. He walked away from the arrangement richer, more respected, and comfortably tied to the mother of the king's only acknowledged bastard. A neat little package. Sometimes the gifts were even more direct. Manors, farmlands, annuities. A woman could go from maid of honour to lady of an estate in a matter of months. One fringe case involves a mistress who was given a hunting lodge and 20 barrels of wine a year. She lived quietly into her 60s, never remarried, and was known to entertain poets and local nobility with suspiciously good food and a harpist paid by a royal pension. You see, this wasn't just generosity, it was a tactic. Once a mistress had served her role, comforter, distraction, provider of an heir or simply a steadying presence in chaotic times, the crown had to ensure her silence, her safety, her distance, because the last thing a king wants is yesterday's affair turning into tomorrow's liability. The pensions were the cleverest part. Usually paid quarterly, they were just enough to keep a woman comfortable, but not wealthy enough to fund rebellion. They came with conditions, of course. Don't return to court. Don't write memoirs. Don't stir up old rumours. In return, you get a roof, some servants, and the promise that your children will marry well, if not too well. You walk through one of these houses now, long since emptied. The floorboards creak. A peacock feather fan lies broken in a corner. In the study, there's a desk still bearing the ink stains of letters never sent. You imagine the mistress who lived here, once touched by royal hands, now brushing dust from her sleeves as she watches the seasons pass. The silence must have been deafening. Not all mistresses accepted their golden cages so easily. Some demanded more, land in multiple counties, positions for brothers or sons. One famously asked for and received a lifetime supply of imported oranges, which sounds absurd until you realise how expensive they were. That was real power, the ability to make frivolity official. There were also attempts at rehabilitation. Now that your services are no longer required, the tone goes, how about a respectable marriage? If the woman was young and still considered beautiful, a match could be arranged, often with a nobleman in need of royal favour, or a widower whose loyalty needed a bump. These marriages weren't exactly romantic, but they were contracts, just like everything else in Tudor life. Of course, not all gifts were enough to erase the past. Some mistresses lived with a strange kind of half-honour, respected locally but whispered about in London. Their daughters might be welcomed at court, but their names were always mentioned with a raised eyebrow. Their sons might join the army or enter the church, but never too high. The ceiling had been set. One heartbreaking case involves a woman, never officially named, who was gifted a small estate near York. She lived there for decades, unmarried, and died alone. Her will left everything to a niece with one instruction, that a certain locked trunk never be opened. Of course, it was opened later. Inside, dozens of letters, all unsigned, all written in the same hand, the king's likely. Scholars still debate their authenticity, but the estate, the money, the sudden comfort, it all fits the pattern. You come to understand that these gifts weren't acts of affection. They were containment strategies, a way of sanitizing history. If you give someone enough, you hope they won't ask for more, that they'll vanish into comfort, into domesticity, into a life of controlled luxury. It rarely worked as cleanly as intended. The debate still burns among historians. Were these women being compensated for emotional trauma, or were they collaborators in a transactional system? Was the land a reward for silence or simply recognition of service? Again, the line blurs. Some mistresses may have felt genuinely grateful, others insulted, and some may have used these assets to build quiet empires of influence, networks of landowners and cousins who remembered who paid their debts. You read an inventory list from one such woman's estate, dozens of books, foreign silks, a wine cellar twice the size of her kitchen. She lived well, unmarried, occasionally visited by court friends. She was never seen in public again after her dismissal, but her name appears, curiously, on the guest list for her son's knighting ceremony years later. A ghost in fine velvet. And so you realise these mistresses didn't vanish, they just stopped being talked about. The crown gave them homes. Comfort, silence. Not because they were forgotten, but because they were too important to leave behind. You step back out into the garden, where the roses are overgrown and the fountain has long since dried up. The estate is quiet now, but once it echoed with the footfalls of someone history calls minor. Someone who was quietly handed the keys to a kingdom if only for a moment, and then paid to never mention it again. You're in the Queen's chambers now, boy, and the quiet is like a scream with nowhere to go. There's tapestries flutter faintly from a breeze that doesn't reach the back of the room. She's sitting near the hearth, back straight, face unreadable, embroidery in her lap, though the needle hasn't moved in minutes. And tonight, you're staying with her. Because if there's one person who always knew when the king had taken a mistress, it was the Queen. So tonight, you ask the question no one dared ask her to her face. What does a queen do when her husband wants someone else? You start with Catherine of Aragon, regal, Sonish, impeccably Catholic. She was married to Henry VIII for 24 years, and during that time she endured, quietly, at least a handful of mistresses, Elizabeth Blount, Mary Boleyn, others whose names history barely bothered to remember. Catherine never caused a public scene. She didn't sob in front of the court or storm out of mass. No, she practiced the ultimate royal performance, endurance. She smiled when required, prayed when necessary, and watched the king fall in and out of obsession like a man caught in a fever. But behind the scenes, she fought, not with swords or speeches, but with dignity, with silence sharpened enough to draw blood. When Henry demanded an annulment so he could marry Anne Boleyn, Catherine didn't beg. She called herself Queen. She refused to step aside. She said flatly that she was his true wife, before God and the law. Her refusal set off a chain reaction that split the country in half, and even as Anne rose, Catherine held her place, not on the throne, but in the hearts of many who still called her the real queen. Now you're standing behind Anne herself. That's right, mistress turned queen, finally on the throne, only to watch it happen to her. You can feel the irony tighten around her like the laces of her gown. Anne had replaced Catherine, and now she was being replaced too. Jane Seymour is young, pale, quiet, everything Anne is not, and Henry, now bloated with age and pressure, looks at Jane the same way he once looked at Anne, with desire disguised as destiny. Anne sees it happening. She knows the signs, because she was the sign. The missed glances, the late-night conversations, the sudden distance at meals, and then, the worst insult, the public favouring. When the king started paying attention to a woman in front of the Queen, it was no longer a flirtation. It was a message. Anne did not take it quietly. She fought loudly and sharply. She accused Jane of stealing her husband. She shouted. She even once tore a jewel from Jane's hand in full view of the court. But Anne's power was already slipping. Henry had begun referring to her temper. And you know what happens when a woman's rage is no longer seen as strength but as evidence of instability. Within months, Anne would lose not just her husband's affection, but her head. Then comes Jane Seymour. The quiet one, the loyal one, the woman who kept her opinions soft and her presence softer. She too becomes queen, but her story ends almost before it begins. She dies in childbirth after giving Henry his long-desired son, and so she never lives to watch him stray. In a cruel twist, she becomes the only one of his 6 wives he never betrays, not by choice but by fate. But what about the others? Anne of Cleves, who famously had the good sense to not fight. She knew the marriage was a mistake. So when Henry started favouring Catherine Howard, Anne smiled, stepped aside and took her divorce settlement, palaces, lands, a healthy pension, and lived comfortably as the king's beloved sister. She outlived them all. Catherine Howard, of course, was too young and inexperienced to see it coming. She was Henry's fifth wife, barely 17, and while the king's interest in her began with all the fire of his past obsessions, it didn't last. And when his eye began to wander again, she made the fatal mistake of wandering too. Her own affairs, real or imagined, became the fuel for her execution. Once again the Queen paid the price. Finally, Catherine Parr, his sixth and last wife, widowed twice already, clever beyond her years, and smart enough to turn her role into something more maternal. When the king strayed, if he did, she said nothing. She focused on nursing his ailments, managing his children's education, and surviving. And it worked. She outlived him. That was the game now. Don't win, just outlast. But what did these queens feel? That's what you want to know. We'll never really be sure. The historical record is written in what wasn't said, but you can guess. Loneliness, humiliation, rage too dangerous to speak aloud. These weren't just kings cheating on their wives. These were gods, ordained by heaven, publicly preferring other women, then expecting the queens to smile through it. And the queens did smile, until they didn't. Some played the long game, some didn't get the chance, but all of them knew what it meant when the king started looking elsewhere. Less power, less influence, fewer allies. Your enemies grew bold, your letters went unanswered. Your position, once untouchable, began to wobble. Not because of your choices, but because of his whims. There's a scholarly debate still brewing. Should we pity these queens or admire them? Were they trapped victims of a brutal system? Or steel-hearted survivors who mastered diplomacy under impossible conditions? Maybe both, maybe neither. Maybe the truth lies somewhere between Catherine of Aragon, praying alone in her chamber, and Anne Boleyn, clinging to Henry's sleeve at their last supper together. You pass their portraits now, hung side by side in a dusty gallery. They look calm, composed, but their eyes tell another story. You see it, the tightness around the mouth, the carefully chosen jewellery, the slight tilt of the head that says I see everything, and I'm pretending I don't. That's the real language of queens. And here's the irony that sticks with you long after you've left the chamber. History remembers the mistresses as temptresses, homewreckers, pawns. But the queens are the ones who had to endure it all, publicly, constantly, with grace sharp enough to draw blood. They were crowned, yes, but they were also caged. And some cages are built with velvet and gold. You're kneeling on cold stone now in a candlelit chapel that smells like old wood, beeswax, and something older still. Guilt, maybe, or memory. A royal mistress sits beside you, her gown pooling at her feet, her fingers laced tightly in her lap. She doesn't look up at the altar. Her eyes are fixed on the flickering flame of a single votive candle. And tonight you sit with her in the quiet reckoning that comes when sin meets sanctuary. Because in a world ruled by men, lust, and laws written in Latin, even the king's mistress had to answer to someone, and that someone often wore robes, carried incense, and spoke in absolution. Religion was everywhere in Tudor England. It wasn't just a Sunday obligation, it was the air everyone breathed. Every meal began with prayer. Every birth and death passed through a church door. And for a mistress, especially one not married, not pure, not forgiven by a public morality, the weight of sin was more than metaphorical. It pressed down on her with every glance from a priest, every sideways whisper near a shrine, every reminder that the king's love didn't count as holy. And so she confesses. Not publicly, of course, never that. Confession for a royal mistress was usually a private affair, cloaked, quiet, half-secret. Not because her sins were particularly rare, but because they were known. Everyone already suspected. The difference was saying it out loud. "I have lain with the king," she might whisper to her confessor, "and I was not his wife." And what is he supposed to say to that? It depended on the priest. Some were political. They nodded gravely, gave her penance, and passed the information on to higher clergy, or sometimes to the king himself. Others were compassionate. They reminded her that even Mary Magdalene found grace, that sin, when repented, could still be washed away. But the best and rarest simply listened. Because forgiveness is complicated when your sin is also your survival. You think of Anne Boleyn, who was devout to the point of obsession. She carried a small book of hours everywhere, scrawled prayers in the margins, quoted scripture like armour. Her faith wasn't performative, it was internal, sharp, demanding, and yet she sinned, by the standards of the day. She fell into lust, ambition, marriage, with a man not legally free. Did she confess before the sword fell? Yes, by all accounts she did. Her final words were soaked in religious submission. Whether she felt forgiven, well, that's something only the walls of the tower knew. But not all mistresses turned queens. Most remained in their ambiguous limbo, half sinner, half saint, depending on which bishop was talking. Elizabeth Blount was known to be pious after her affair ended. She gave to local churches, funded a small chapel near her estate. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps gratitude. Maybe she simply understood that in Tudor England, one did not step away from sin without building a church behind them. You hear a fringe tale, barely mentioned in the records, of a mistress who confessed so regularly her priest begged her to stop coming. "Your soul is not damned," he reportedly said, "but your mind insists on living in the fire." She left a rosary behind, carved from ivory, the beads worn down from years of restless counting. No one knows her name, just that she wept often. The Reformation complicates everything. Suddenly, the lines blur even more. The king is the head of the church now, so what does it mean to sin against a man who writes the rules? If Henry VIII says his mistress is pure enough to become queen, who can argue? Confession changes, penance becomes political, the old priests are replaced, the Latin is swapped for English, and the women, they adapt. One mistress reportedly asked her confessor whether it was more sinful to refuse the king than to surrender to him. That's not a joke, it was a serious question. Say no and you insult God's anointed. Say yes and you break the seventh commandment. There was no right answer, just consequences. You imagine a woman kneeling before the altar after the king has moved on, her body still marked by his affection, her heart torn between what she was told was sacred and what she was forced to do to survive. Does she feel dirty, redeemable, empowered? Some historians argue, though, that the church manipulated women with shame. Others believe that confession was one of the only spaces where these women could reclaim control, by naming their sins on their own terms. The chapel offers no response. There's something deeply theatrical about all of this. Mistresses don't wear crowns, but they do wear guilt like one. Whether they believe in hell or not, they know what it means to be judged. By other women, by priests, by history. So they pray, some out of habit, some out of desperation, and some because, if you've lost favour at court, there's only one more throne left to kneel before. You watch as the mistress beside you lights a final candle and stands. Her face is unreadable, not defiant, not broken, just still. She walks back into the world knowing that forgiveness might be real, or might be a story she tells herself to sleep at night. Either way, it's the only currency she has left. You remain a moment longer in the pews, the wind rattles the stained glass slightly. And you realise that in the grand game of power and pleasure, it wasn't always the king who had the final word. Sometimes it was God. You're alone in a candlelit storeroom now, your fingers tracing the brittle edge of parchment as dust dances in the air like something alive. The room smells of old vellum and lavender oil. Someone tried to preserve these things once. You're not supposed to be here, and certainly not supposed to be touching this. A letter, folded 3 times, sealed with a faint impression of a signet long worn to smooth. It rests like a secret that almost never made it. Tonight, you're reading the words that weren't meant to survive. The scraps of longing, power and pleading that somehow escaped the fire. Tonight is about letters that shouldn't exist. Because here's the truth no one likes to admit. The most dangerous object in the Tudor court wasn't a dagger or a cup of poisoned wine, it was a letter. Written in haste, hidden in a glove, folded into the spine of a prayer book. And when you're a royal mistress, those letters are lifelines and nooses in equal measure. You begin with Henry VIII's infamous letters to Anne Boleyn. 17 of them survive. 17 glimpses into the king's aching, petulant heart. He writes to her as if he's a lovesick teenager, calling her his mistress and friend, obsessing over her absence, showering her with awkward praise and breathless desperation. He signs one with "written by the hand of your loyal servant and lover." You don't know whether to swoon or cringe, but what's more incredible than the content is that they still exist at all. Anne didn't return them. She kept them, or someone did. Perhaps for leverage, perhaps for memory, perhaps because part of her liked being able to hold the king's heart in her hand on paper, with his ink still fresh. Eventually they were stolen by whom we'll never know, and now they're stored in the Vatican, which feels like poetic revenge for the man who ripped England from the Pope's grasp just to marry the woman who once read them. Then there are the hidden drafts, letters never sent, or perhaps copied in someone's hand to avoid discovery. You hold one now, unsigned, possibly by Jane Seymour before she became queen. The handwriting is neat, measured, the words are soft but firm. She refuses a gift. I cannot accept what is not mine to earn, it says. It could be forgery, it could be fiction, but it feels real. And in a court where feelings got people killed, that's saying something. There's a love poem, barely legible now, scrawled on the back of a lute chord chart. It's addressed to the dark-eyed lady in blue and signed only with an initial. Some say it was written to Mary Shelton, another of Henry's brief favourites. Others argue it's nothing at all, just court poetry. But again, nothing at court was just anything. You stumble across a scrap of a much sadder kind. A note tucked into a book of hours, smudged with what might be tears or rain. It reads, "He promised to come, but the candles burned to nubs, and only the wind answered." It isn't signed. You'll never know if it was written by a mistress, a lady-in-waiting, or someone with more poetry than sense, but it stayed hidden between those pages for centuries, and that makes it matter. Historians, of course, are constantly at war over these things. Are the surviving letters genuine, or elaborate forgeries? Are they romantic expressions or political manoeuvrings? Can you trust a word when the author had every reason to lie, flatter, or seduce? Some argue that Henry's letters to Anne reveal true emotion. Others say it was all manipulation, part of a carefully orchestrated campaign to win her compliance. The truth is slippery, folded, sealed, and buried somewhere between the lines. And then there are the letters that should exist, but don't. Where are the replies? Anne's letters to Henry, surely she wrote them. What happened to those? Burned? Stolen? Hidden in the chambers of a jealous queen or the hands of a shrewd servant who knew better than to get caught with such dynamite? Their absence is its own presence. It leaves a hole in the story that makes it even more compelling. One fringe theory, that you'd be forgiven for dismissing as pure fan fiction, claims that Anne Boleyn penned a final letter to Henry from the Tower the night before her execution. In it, she allegedly pleads for justice, professes her innocence, and signs off as your most loyal wife and wronged queen. Some claim it was intercepted, never delivered. Others insist it's a forgery created long after her death to stir sympathy. But wouldn't you love to believe it? That her final word was written, not screamed from a scaffold. You return to the storeroom and find one last relic. A letter written, not to a king, but about one. A mistress, anonymous, describes life after favour. "I feel as though I live on the edge of a great fire," she writes, "no longer inside its warmth, but still too close to sleep." That line stays with you, because that's what these letters are. Warmth, warning, and wakefulness, all at once. You realise something else as you sit there. Surrounded by the ghosts of ink and parchment, these women weren't supposed to have voices. Not officially. Their words weren't preserved in Parliament or carved into monuments, but they wrote anyway. In secret, in stolen moments, in borrowed books and behind fans and under candlelight. They wrote themselves into history not through declarations, but through love letters and lost notes, pressed between the pages of a world that tried to forget them. And even centuries later, their voices still whisper, not loudly, but just enough. You're standing in the liminal space between two kingdoms, in the velvet-swathed corridor of a court that is not quite English and not entirely French. A place stitched together by the diplomacy and desire. Tonight you chase the elusive figure of Jane Poppincourt, one of the more enigmatic mistresses, or was she, to flicker across the Tudor stage. She's a woman who straddled courts and cultures, loyalty and longing, forever half in shadow. And in her story you glimpse the strange silken world of those who lived between identities, courtiers without borders, lovers without certainties. Jane is already at court when you first see her, poised and unbothered in a silk gown that doesn't quite follow the English fashion. That's your first clue. She's French, or at least raised there, a product of that court's polished, sensuous style. She arrived in England not as a flirtation, but as a tutor. Brought over to educate Henry VII's daughters in French language and customs, she was supposed to be discreet, well-mannered, invisible. But like most women who end up in history's footnotes, she had the audacity to be interesting. The first whispers begin not in the English court, but in France. It's said that Jane had been the mistress of the French king, or perhaps of one of his courtiers, depending on the source and how much wine the gossipers had consumed. She was elegant, mysterious, Not beautiful in the blunt way that Tudor mistresses were often described, but refined in a way that made English nobles tilt their heads and watch. When she returned to England, now speaking both courts' languages like a native, she brought with her something far more dangerous than beauty: knowledge. Jane understood both sides of the political chessboard. She knew which French prince favoured war and which favoured wine. She knew the taste of French perfume and the weight of English suspicion. Henry VIII noticed her, not because she was young, she wasn't, but because she was clever. By the time their flirtation began, he was still the dashing young prince, not yet bloated with power and paranoia. Jane had experience, and experience in a court filled with 15-year-olds and manufactured virgins was irresistible. But was she really his mistress? That's the question historians still chew on. The record is maddeningly vague. One account refers to her as in much favour with the king. Another describes her as delicate of speech and free in heart. Neither confirms the kind of relationship she had with Henry, but we do know that she lingered longer than most women who didn't matter. She stayed at court. She moved in circles where she could overhear everything. She wasn't dismissed. Until suddenly she was. The story goes that Jane was engaged to be married to a Frenchman named Seigneur de Bourg, but the match fell apart, possibly due to the scandal surrounding her reputation, or perhaps because she had simply grown too comfortable on English soil. Eventually she was pushed out. Quietly, no trial, no tower, just a polite disappearance. That in itself is revealing. She wasn't powerful enough to be dangerous, but she wasn't insignificant either. You imagine her packing her gowns, folding her letters, wrapping up the gold chain given to her in appreciation by a courtier who once tried to impress her with a poem. She leaves behind no confirmed children, no landed title, no famous death. But she leaves a mark anyway. There's a fringe theory that Jane served as a secret informant for the French during her time in Henry's court, that she reported back to Francis I, offering scraps of gossip wrapped in soft vowels. There's no proof, but you can see how the idea formed. A woman fluent in 2 languages, welcomed into the private rooms of nobles, possibly the king himself. It wouldn't take much to slip a word into the right ear, or a letter into the wrong pouch. Others argue she was merely a pawn, tolerated for a time, then discarded when her value waned. And still others insist she was a prototype, a woman who used her cross-cultural fluency and ambiguous status to carve out influence in a world that rarely let women do so openly. Mistress or not, Jane Poppincourt lived on the edge of legitimacy, where the boundaries of diplomacy and desire blurred. Her story gives you something rare in Tudor mistressdom, a woman whose power wasn't just in her body, but in her access. She wasn't born to a high house. She didn't bear a child to the king. She didn't even get a dramatic fall. And yet she was there, teaching, listening, possibly loving, certainly manoeuvring. She reminds you that influence doesn't always come from scandal. Sometimes it comes from simply being there, long enough to see everything. You walk through the royal apartments and imagine her ghost still drifting between rooms, pausing beside the Queen's embroidery, laughing gently at a French jest, noting which way the political wind is blowing today. She's not remembered like the Boleyns or the Seymours. She doesn't have a scandal attached to her name that made it into the history books, but she was one of the first women in Henry's orbit to teach the court that intelligence could be seductive. That knowledge could be wielded like a fan, graceful, fluttering, and capable of slicing cleanly when opened just right. So perhaps that's why she matters. Not for what she did, but for what she showed was possible. You leave the corridor behind, her name still echoing faintly in your mind. Jane Poppincourt, not a queen, not even a confirmed mistress, but a woman who walked the halls of kings and left footprints where no one expected to find them. And sometimes that's enough. You're standing in a stone chamber that smells of damp wool and something colder. Fear, maybe, or the stale echo of too many secrets. The guards shift their weight, uncomfortable. A clerk scribbles something down and avoids eye contact. In the centre of the room, a woman trembles, not from shame, not even from anger, but from the crushing realization that her greatest mistake wasn't loving the king, it was letting him stop. Tonight, you're standing witness to the brutal price of passion turned political. This is the section no one wants to believe, but everyone needs to hear. Punishments for loving the king. You thought the role of royal mistress was a path to pleasure and prestige? You've seen the silks and jewels, the lush estates and quiet pensions. But those are for the lucky ones, the ones who knew when to step back or who were shielded by marriage or obscurity. Not every woman got to walk away, some fell, and when they fell it wasn't into scandal, it was into prison, disgrace or death. Start of course with Anne Boleyn, the glittering star who rose from mistress to queen and whose head, as the story goes, was cut off in one clean stroke. You've heard the big headlines: adultery, incest, treason. But look closer. Beneath the charges lies a simple truth: she stopped being useful. She failed to give Henry a surviving son, and she refused to fade quietly into the background. And once Jane Seymour appeared, demure and fertile seeming, Anne's fate was sealed. The charges were built from dust and envy. Accused of sleeping with multiple men, including her own brother, Anne was tried and condemned in a performance of justice so hollow you can hear it rattle through history. And whether she was guilty or not, spoiler, she almost certainly wasn't, her real crime was the same as every other fallen mistress. She became a political threat. That's when loving the king becomes a liability. Catherine Howard is next, young, barely educated, a pawn placed into the king's path by the Duke of Norfolk and her ambitious family. She became queen so fast she likely didn't have time to grasp the danger she was in. And when the rumours of her past began to surface, old flirtations, a music teacher, a boy with a quick smile, her downfall was as swift as it was inevitable. But it wasn't just her past that doomed her. It was the suggestion of present betrayal. A letter found, a meeting alleged. Her former lover, Thomas Culpeper, arrested, tortured, confessed, under pressure or truth, we'll never know. Catherine too was executed, accused of high treason, her crime framed as a personal betrayal of a man whose love had become as lethal as it was obsessive. And yet it didn't always require adultery or treason. Some women suffered merely because they were remembered too vividly. There's the case of Elizabeth Bessie Holland, one of Catherine Howard's attendants and possibly a former mistress of Henry herself. She was arrested for helping facilitate Catherine's secret meetings. Was she loyal, naive, trying to protect a friend? It didn't matter. She was interrogated, humiliated, imprisoned for a time. Her life, after that, blotted out. The punishment wasn't always death. Sometimes it was slower. A public fall from grace, a ruined reputation, families stripped of titles, land taken. A once beloved daughter returned to her childhood home like a scandal wrapped in silk. You read about a woman, name redacted by the chronicler, who refused the king's advances. She wasn't punished openly, of course, but her father lost his court post. Her brother's betrothal fell through. A subtle, poisonous revenge. There's a fringe record, half believed, half disbelieved, of a woman who attempted to take her own life after being set aside by the king. The cause of her fall isn't named, perhaps it was a real affair or just a rumour, but the outcome was clear. She was dismissed, humiliated, and sent to a convent. The royal pension arrived, but she never spent it. She died within the year, her funeral sparsely attended, her name etched into a stone that no one visits now. So why did these punishments happen? Was it about morality? Of course not. Kings could sin with impunity. The court could wink at all kinds of indecency, so long as it was discreet, temporary, and politically harmless. But once a mistress stirred trouble, once she became too powerful, too bold, too remembered, the crown had to clean house. Because in Tudor politics, nothing was more dangerous than a woman the king had once loved too much. That kind of affection left fingerprints on everything. Policies bent, favours granted. Families elevated. And once the king moved on, all those ties became a liability. Enemies circled, allies evaporated. And the woman at the centre of it all, she became expendable. Scholars still argue about the nature of these punishments. Were they coordinated campaigns, or the inevitable decay of power when royal favour ends? Some say the women brought it on themselves, too proud, too reckless, too involved in matters above their station. Others insist they were scapegoats, victims of a court that built women up for sport, then tore them down for survival. You want the truth? The truth is the system was built to break women, especially women who made the mistake of being visible, desirable, and ambitious, especially mistresses. So you step back now, out of the interrogation room, out of the chapel where confessions went unheard, out of the cell where a letter was never delivered. And you remember this. Not every royal mistress ended her days in a country house filled with roses and gold-rimmed goblets. Some ended them here, in cold rooms, surrounded by silence, asking themselves what their love was really worth. and what it cost. You're standing in the garden now, near a crumbling sundial that no one winds anymore. The sun is setting over the edge of the orchard, and for the first time in a long time, the court is quiet. No feasts, no masks, no galloping rumours. Because tonight, the king is bored, and that, more than scandal or treason or ambition, is the slow, soft death of a royal mistress's power. Tonight, you sit in the uncomfortable silence that follows obsession. Because when the king grows bored, the music stops, and you're still dancing. At first, the change is so small you almost don't notice. A dinner passes without a glance. A letter goes unanswered. The chamberlain skips your name on the list for the hunting party. You're still at court, still wearing fine gowns, still sitting close to the queen, still being nodded at by those who once bent to you, but the warmth is gone. That subtle shift in the king's tone, the way he used to lean in when you spoke. Gone? Now he leans out towards someone else. You've seen it happen before, to other women. You've even gossiped about it. Lady Alice, poor thing, one moment she's riding beside him, next she's sent off to Wiltshire with a basket of pears and a polite note. But now it's you, and it doesn't feel like gossip. It feels like you're standing in a room that was once full of candles, and someone snuffed them out one by one, quietly. The court is skilled at picking up on these things. You used to be approached with care, measured flattery, gifts disguised as pleasantries, quiet offers of assistance. Now you're met with a different kind of politeness. The not quite looking you in the eye sort. The we should catch up later smile that never turns into a conversation. The younger ladies start standing a little closer to the king. They laugh louder. One of them wears your colour to a feast. Bold. Even the queen seems to notice. Depending on who she is at the time, her reaction varies. If it's Anne, there's satisfaction flickering behind her lashes. If it's Jane, perhaps a trace of sympathy. Catherine Parr, she probably pities you. But they all understand the game. The mistress is only dangerous when she's adored. Once she's not, she's just awkward. So what happens next? It depends on how you play it. Some women cling, they write letters, they cry they plead with courtiers, slay up notes into books, beg the king for one more audience. It never ends well. The desperation is too loud. It confirms what everyone already suspects. Your moment has passed. Others try to pivot. They throw their lot in with another nobleman. Marry quickly, accept a political match and pretend it was their idea all along. A few even succeed. They reinvent themselves as wives, landowners, patrons of the arts. One former mistress builds a school in her name. Another retreats to a nunnery, possibly of her own choosing, probably not. But the most interesting ones, they disappear on their own terms. They see the signs and bow out gracefully. No tantrum, no farewell letter, just a quiet exit from the scene before they're shoved out. It's the most elegant way to fall and the rarest, because it takes a kind of strength to leave before the music stops. You hear about one such woman, a mistress who, realising the king's attention had drifted, requested to retire to her family's estate to recover from a persistent cough. She left behind only a prayer book and a pair of gloves embroidered with the royal crest. No letters, no public statements. Within a year she was married to a wealthy baron and had a child on the way. Some say the king wrote her once more. Others say he forgot her name. Either version might be true. The boredom of the king is, in many ways, more lethal than his fury. At least when he's angry, he remembers you. When he's bored, you vanish. You become something he once enjoyed, like a tapestry that no longer matches the room. And once he forgets, the court forgets faster. There's a fringe anecdote about a mistress who tried to reignite the spark by composing a song, flute, lute, voice. She had it performed at court by a group of minstrels during a feast. The lyrics were obvious, too obvious. The king barely looked up from his plate. She was sent to the country within the week. The song survives in a dusty archive. No one plays it anymore. Historians argue over the fate of these discarded women. Were they victims of a fickle man, or casualties of a system that only valued women when they were new, useful or pregnant? Some claim they wielded real power, even in decline. Others insist they were illusions of agency, allowed to exist only while they entertained. And you? You've seen both sides now. The power, the peril, the pacing sadness when the king turns his gaze elsewhere. And then there's the loneliness. That might be the cruelest part. After the excitement, the rush, the attention, the isolation feels brutal. Your former allies drift away. The nobles stop sending wine. You hear about the court's latest gossip from a letter, not a conversation. You're still wearing the dress he liked, but he's already complimented someone else's. Eventually, the court stops talking about you entirely, and in a world where your name was once spoken with awe or envy, that kind of silence is almost unbearable, but not final. Because here's the secret no one says out loud. The king always gets bored with mistresses, with wives, with policies. The only question is how you survive the silence. Some do, some don't. And you're still standing, which means there's time yet to rewrite the ending. You're watching a woman brush her hair by candlelight, slow, steady, 100 strokes in practiced rhythm, each one as silent as the breath she's trying to steady. The court is asleep, or pretending to be, but her mind isn't. Because tonight, she's thinking about her job, not embroidery or attending the Queen, not composing a flattering verse or rehearsing a dance, her real job. The most dangerous, most unacknowledged, or most quietly powerful position at the Tudor court, royal mistress. And make no mistake, it's a job. One that comes with perks, yes, but also scrutiny, isolation, and a daily risk of ruin. Welcome to the court's most dangerous position. You've seen the jewellery, the gowns, the gifts. From the outside it looks like a dream, a rise from obscurity to luxury, the adoration of a king, the envy of a court. But look closer. Beneath the pearls her hands are raw, her stomach is in knots. Every word she speaks is rehearsed, every movement considered. She's always being watched, not because people love her, but because they're waiting for her to trip. Being the king's mistress isn't about beauty. That's the bait. The job requires something deeper. Strategy, nerve, timing, a working knowledge of politics, a tolerance for the hypocrisy, and above all, restraint. Say too much and you become a threat. Say too little and you become forgettable. The sweet spot is narrow, and the consequences for missing it are steep. You step into her shoes. You're given new gowns, yes, but only so people can pick you apart more precisely. You're seated at feasts where everyone smiles but no one trusts you. You walk through gardens with hidden messages being passed 2 paces behind you. You wake up wondering if today is the day the king stops calling, or worse, the day he decides you're embarrassing. You can't even trust your own reflection. A mirror will tell you you're still beautiful, still wanted, but the gossip might say otherwise. And gossip is what shapes reality in court. You hear that your laughter is too loud, that the Queen's cousin thinks you're ambitious, that your latest poem was poorly received. Do you deny it? Do you shrug it off? Do you retaliate? Each choice is a move on the chessboard. You can't afford mistakes, and you have no allies. Not really. The Queen despises you or pities you, which is worse. The ladies in waiting see you as a stepping stone or a cautionary tale. The men who once flirted with you now keep a careful distance, afraid of being accused of treason by association. Even your own family might begin negotiating your replacement if they sense your influence waning. Loyalty is a currency, and you're burning through it fast. You try to anchor yourself. Maybe you write letters, clever, flirtatious, just vague enough to be read aloud without scandal. Maybe you align yourself with a faction. Maybe you patronize poets, sponsor masques, whisper to secretaries. But always, there's the edge of danger. Because what happens if the next woman is younger, or sweeter, or has a cousin on the Privy Council? There's a fringe account, mostly ignored by serious historians, of a mistress who survived 5 years at court by pretending to be deeply pious. She attended every mass, fasted publicly. She even insisted on sleeping alone, claiming she and the king met only to discuss scripture. Was it true? Probably not, but it was genius. Who could accuse a woman of ambition if she's too holy to scheme? Of course, others weren't so careful. One mistress tried to use her influence to sway a marriage contract for her brother. It backfired. The king heard about it, and within days, her apartments were reassigned. Another woman accepted a necklace from a foreign diplomat. The necklace was a trap, proof of outside influence. She was sent to a convent in the north. She lasted 2 winters. You begin to see how narrow the margins are. One wrong gesture, one offhanded joke, one honest opinion said too close to the wrong ear. That's all it takes, and no one will defend you, because no one ever admits you had power in the first place. Your role doesn't exist on paper, you're not on the council, you hold no office, and yet every decision made in private passes through you, filtered through kisses and compliments and laughter at the right moment. Some say that royal mistresses were pawns. Others argue they were queens without crowns. The truth? They were both, and neither. They were survivors in a court designed to consume women and forget them. Their power was temporary. Their influence, conditional. and the reward for playing the game well was only that you could keep playing for a little longer. You hear her now, the woman brushing her hair. She sighs, not dramatically, just quietly. She knows the king still loves her, for now, but she also knows she's aging. She's read to the poems. She's seen how quickly radiant becomes one in a courtier's mouth. She's rehearsing the future in her head, what she'll do when the summons stop coming. Whether she'll accept a marriage, whether she'll retire to an estate and start over, or stay in court long enough to become the former favourite, a role even more precarious than mistress. She finishes brushing, pins her hair, blows out the candle. The room goes dark. You're left with the knowledge that she will sleep lightly. She always does. Because being the king's mistress isn't something you are. It's something you do, and it's the most dangerous job at court, not because it comes with enemies, but because it comes with an expiration date carved invisibly into every smile. And when that date arrives, no one will save you. They'll just whisper your name as someone else takes your place. You're in the gardens again, but this time you're not watching the queen or the current favourite. You're watching a woman who's doing something rare. So rare, in fact, it hardly seems possible in Tudor England. She's walking away, not from the court, not from disgrace, not from exile. She's walking away from the king himself. Tonight, you trace the steps of the boldest, most quietly radical figures in the entire game of royal desire, the mistresses who said no. It's almost a myth, isn't it? The idea that anyone could refuse Henry VIII, a monarch accustomed to obedience, worship, and velvet-clad flirtation on demand. But it happened. Not often. And certainly not without consequences. But there were women, sharp, clever, stubborn women, who looked power in the face and decided they'd rather have their dignity than a royal bed. Start with Anne Bassett, one of the more frequently mentioned names in this rare category. A maid of honour to Queen Jane Seymour and later to Queen Catherine Howard, Anne caught the king's eye during a time when he was in between favourites. Young, beautiful and well-connected, she checked every box on the unspoken mistress checklist. But Anne never took the bait. Henry pursued her, gifts, compliments, attention at feasts, and yet somehow she always managed to remain just out of reach. Courteous, never rude, present, but not too available. She wasn't a fool, she knew exactly what he wanted, and what it would cost her. And she wasn't the only one. Margaret Shelton, Anne Boleyn's cousin, reportedly drew Henry's attention briefly during Anne's reign. Some records suggest Margaret was encouraged by the Boleyn faction to accept his affection. Better to keep the king's eye within the family than let it wander toward political rivals. But even Margaret, it seems, resisted going too far. Historians disagree on whether the relationship became physical, but what's clear is that it didn't last. Either the king lost interest or she didn't play the game. Now, let's be clear. Saying no to a king didn't always look like slamming a door. It often looked like artful evasion, a headache, a conveniently timed trip to the countryside, a chaperone who lingered a little too long. These women became experts at self-preservation through delay. In some cases, the refusal was political, protecting a family's reputation or securing a better marriage. In others, it was personal. These women knew their value, and they weren't interested in trading it for a brief flash of power that would likely end in disgrace. One fringe story, told more in court whispers than in actual records, involves a woman named Alice Restwold. She was not particularly high-born or especially beautiful, but something about her wit captured Henry's interest. One evening, during a private audience, he reportedly offered her a brooch, along with a comment that left nothing to interpretation. Alice smiled, took the brooch, and replied, "I prefer gifts not tied to service, your grace." She handed it back. He laughed. She was never summoned again. She also went on to marry a wealthy merchant and live, by all accounts, a very peaceful life. But of course, there was always a risk in saying no. Some refusals had a cost. One noblewoman's brother lost his court post just weeks after she declined to be entertained by the king during a hunting retreat. Nothing was said outright. There were no formal accusations, just the soft, deadly hand of displeasure. In the Tudor court, that was all it took. Still, these women resisted, not out of ignorance, but out of calculation. They understood that becoming a royal mistress might offer temporary elevation, but also permanent scrutiny. One wrong move, one whisper too many, one slip of the tongue, and it could all unravel. Better, some decided, to keep their names unsmudged. Better to remain at court without the target on their back. Better to be unremarkable than infamous. It's important to remember that saying no wasn't always seen as virtue. Sometimes it was seen as arrogance, or worse, rebellion. A woman who turned down a king had to walk a dangerous line, graceful enough to avoid offence, firm enough to avoid misinterpretation. A single misstep could be fatal. And yet some still chose to hold their ground. There's a scholarly debate that persists even now. Why would a woman refuse the king? Was it morality, strategy, fear, self-respect? The answers vary, but most likely it was a combination of all those things, and something else. A clear-eyed understanding of the court's brutal cycle. These women had seen what happened to yesterday's favourites. The jewellery, the affection, the fleeting thrill of attention, all replaced, erased, forgotten. They chose instead the slower, safer path. They chose themselves. It's tempting to paint them as noble heroines, untouched by temptation. But the truth is more nuanced. They weren't saints, they were survivors, realists, women who read the room and knew the odds. And in a court obsessed with romance and reputation, their refusal was more radical than any scandalous affair. You walk behind one of them now, name unknown, gown simple, expression calm. She's not remembered in poems or letters. There are no portraits of her smiling next to a royal crest, but she was there. She saw the way the game was played, and she chose not to play, and in a strange way she won, because the mistresses who said yes, they were celebrated briefly, then discarded, their names attached to scandal, their families entangled in politics, their legacies stained by survival. But the ones who said no, they left the stage quietly and with their dignity intact. You pause by a marble bench where one of them used to sit. She once watched the king walk by, flirted just enough to stay safe, and smiled just enough to be remembered, but never crossed the line. Her story wasn't dramatic enough for the historians, but you see her now more clearly than ever. Sometimes the boldest choice isn't ambition, sometimes it's absence. You're in the archives now, deep beneath the grand echo of the palace halls, where the air tastes of old ink, candle soot, and the delicate crumble of parchment too fragile to unroll. You've got your fingertips on history's least read pages, the ones that don't make it into the glossy documentaries or the royal family trees. These are the scraps that whisper instead of shout. Because tonight you're peering into the warped mirror of time, where the royal mistresses of the Tudor era are reflected not as seductresses or villains, but as complex women flattened by the pens of men. Welcome to the long overdue re-examination of their place in the story, mistresses in the mirror of history. The first thing you realise is how little of them actually survives. Their voices are gone, overwritten by diplomats, chroniclers and satirists who almost never had the courtesy to quote them. What we know about these women comes mostly from the men who judged them, or from the rumours whispered by their rivals. The court loved a good scandal, and the press, even then, knew what sold. The king's mistress was never allowed to be human. She was either an angel of temptation or a devil in brocade. There was no middle ground. Take Mary Boleyn, for example. History remembers her mostly in relation to her more infamous sister. In most records, she's the other Boleyn girl, a footnote with golden hair. She was Henry VIII's mistress, yes, and possibly even bore him children, but she's treated as decoration. Not clever enough, not calculating enough, not important. But in the spaces between the lines, you see something else. A woman who has passed between kings like a gift, who played the role expected of her, and who eventually chose obscurity over political gain. When she married a man far beneath her station, for love no less, her family disowned her. The courage in that move is enormous, and yet we remember her as a footnote. Or take Jane Poppincourt, whom you followed just a few sections ago. She's been called a courtesan, a diplomat's tool, even a French distraction. But peel back the assumptions, and you find a multilingual woman navigating not just a foreign court, but a foreign culture, wielding language and wit in a space where most women weren't even educated. Her story isn't about sex, it's about strategy. And yet that narrative never got written. Even Anne Boleyn, possibly the most dissected woman in English history, is still a mystery. One side paints her as a social climber who used her charm to steal a crown. The other side casts her as a tragic reformer who paid the price for being too clever. But the truth, as always, is both and neither. She wasn't just a temptress, or just a victim. She was the woman who saw how the system worked, and dared to inherit herself into the middle of it. She was ambitious, yes, but so was Henry, so were Cromwell and Wolsey, and nearly every man in court. The difference is that Anne died for hers. Why, you wonder? do historians, especially the earlier ones, so often reduce these women to caricatures? Part of it is moral panic. The idea that a woman could wield influence through desire made people deeply uncomfortable. They couldn't admit that mistresses might be smart or strategic, or worse, sympathetic. So they were flattened into cautionary tales. Look what happens when a woman strays too close to power. Even their physical descriptions betray the bias. Read through the records and you'll see the pattern. Mistresses are either described as astonishing beauties, with an undertone of suspicion, or surprisingly plain, with an undertone of mockery. It's never about who they were, but how well they fit into the fantasy or the failure. Were they worth the scandal? Were they tempting enough to excuse the king? The focus is never on their thoughts, only their thighs. And yet in the margins, you start to recover their truths. A letter signed with a flourish that hints at pride. A donation to a local church that shows piety, not just performance. A will that includes servants by name. A scandalous rumour that, when unpacked, reveals a woman caught between survival and sacrifice. Slowly the mirror clears. Modern historians are finally starting to reframe the conversation. Feminist scholars, cultural historians, even a few bold novelists have begun asking better questions. Not who did she sleep with, but what did she want? Not how did she fall, but what did she risk? There's still pushback, of course. The image of the femme fatale is hard to kill, but the archive is shifting. The footnotes are growing louder. There's even a debate in academic circles now over whether mistress is a helpful term at all. Is it accurate? Is it reductive? Should we call them favourites or influencers, unofficial consorts? You smile at the irony. These women were once denied official titles, and now, centuries later, we're still arguing over what to call them. You lean back from the stack of documents and think about the lives behind the labels. Women who laughed, cried, plotted, prayed. Women who loved the king and maybe even loved him back. Women who made mistakes and tried to fix them. Women who were punished for the same ambition that won men knighthoods. They weren't just side characters. They were central to the drama of the Tudor court, and yes, they have been remembered as shadows. Until now, because if you've learned anything on this journey, it's this. History is not written in stone. It's written in ink, in margins, in erased names and half-kept secrets. And sometimes it's written by someone who stops long enough to look again. So here you are, looking, and seeing them at last in full light. You're standing at the edge now, the final flickering gasp of the Tudor dynasty. When the great glittering machine of court politics starts to rust, and the golden torch of royal passion dims to embers, the mistresses you've followed are long gone, either buried beneath marble or faded into forgotten manners. But the system they moved through, the glances, the whispers, the blood and silk arrangements, it's still there. And now, at last, you meet the woman who outlasts it all. Tonight you follow the last mistress standing. Her name is Catherine Ashley. Well, that's the one history remembers her by. But she's better known as Cat, and her role in the life of Elizabeth I is more complicated than most care to admit. She wasn't technically a mistress. She wasn't a lover of a king. But she was something equally dangerous. A deeply influential woman in the inner world of a queen who was raised in the rubble of her father's disastrous loves. Cat had been a servant, then a governess, then a confidant. She raised Elizabeth from a sharp, wary child into a woman who would never, ever let herself be ruled by a man. But what makes Cat's story remarkable is not just who she advised, but what she witnessed. Because unlike the women who were discarded, disgraced or discreetly married off, Cat survived. She navigated the rise and fall of Henry's wives, the flames of Protestant reform and Catholic revenge, the accusations of treason, and the brutal court of Edward VI. She stood beside Elizabeth through scandal, through exile, and into the crown. She may not have shared a bed with a king, but she understood power intimately. There's a fringe theory that Cat once carried letters between Elizabeth and Thomas Seymour, the ambitious and inappropriately affectionate brother of the Queen's late husband. Whether Cat supported the flirtation or merely tolerated it is up for debate. But one thing is clear, she knew how dangerous love could be. She'd seen it destroy queens and kill mistresses. And when Elizabeth narrowly escaped ruin during that episode, Cat changed. She clung to her queen like armour. She became not just a companion, but a protector. So in a way, Cat was a mistress, not in the sexual sense, but in the sense of influence. She wielded affection, loyalty and access. He knew when to speak and when to vanish. And she never forgot what court favour could do to a woman. That made her powerful. And power, for a woman in Tudor England, was always dangerous. But if you want a true female royal mistress of the Tudor line, the last woman to ever hold the unofficial, deeply precarious role, it would be Lady Catherine Knollys, possibly the illegitimate daughter of Henry VIII and Mary Boleyn. Yes, that Mary Boleyn. That would make Catherine the King's daughter and Elizabeth of Thewel's cousin, or half-sister depending on which historian you trust. Catherine was never officially acknowledged by the Henry, but she was given an unusually favoured position at court, even serving as the chief lady of the bedchamber to Elizabeth I's. In other words, she slept in the same room as the Queen, dressed her, guarded her privacy. That kind of role wasn't handed out lightly. Catherine was loyal, politically savvy, and, according to court gossip, one of the few people Elizabeth truly trusted. Whether she was the child of a king or not, she knew the weight of proximity. And here's the strange symmetry of it all. The final mistress was not a lover of a king, but a woman sazed in the long shadow of royal seduction. The daughters of mistresses, the cousins of queens, the granddaughters of those women who once risked everything for a crown. They were the ones left to pick up the pieces. Elizabeth I herself famously never took a husband. She never married, never named an heir, never let any man claim her body or her power. Coincidence? Hardly. She had seen too much. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had loved and lost more than her head. Her father had discarded women like wilted roses, and the court had punished them all for being too pretty, too clever, too ambitious, too present. Elizabeth knew the game. She refused to play it. Instead, she became the first woman in English history to rule absolutely, not beside a man, but alone. And at her side through the early years of her reign was Cat Ashley. No lords, no lovers, just women who remembered. So in this final chapter, it's not a single mistress you meet. It's a lineage. A tapestry. A line of women, some named, most not, who endured. Women who carried secrets in silken sleeves, who swallowed ambition when necessary, and who shaped the monarchy more than any sword or seal ever could. And here's the most ironic twist of all. When the Tudor dynasty ends, it isn't with a love affair. It ends with a woman who chose not to love publicly at all. The story that began with passion and poetry and trembling hands in candlelit corridors ends in silence, in sovereignty, in legacy. You look back now on all the mistresses, Elizabeth Blount, Mary Boleyn, Anne, Jane, Catherine Howard, and all the forgotten ones who didn't even get a name, and you see them not as cautionary tales, but as trailblazers, survivors, unwilling saints in a court that chewed up devotion and spit it into scandal. They weren't just playthings of kings, they were reflections of their time. And in the case of the last mistress standing, she stood for them all. So now you're lying back, maybe the fan's still humming softly in the background, and you're thinking, wait, that was all real? Oh yes, every subtle glance, every whispered threat, every silk ribbon laced through hair, not just for beauty, but for power, it all happened. These women lived, not in fairy tales or footnotes, but in the jagged edges of royal life. They were not the queens you've heard about in ballads. They weren't even always the mistresses history cared to remember. But they were there, in the soft spaces where empires rose and fell wrapped in perfume, blood and prayer. What makes them unforgettable isn't just the drama. It's the delicate balance they walked between love and leverage, favour and fear, obscurity and legacy. They knew what it meant to be wanted by a king and hated by a court. They knew how to read a room, how to fold a letter just so, how to survive a smile that turned cold, and maybe most of all, they knew how dangerous it was to be visible, and how much more dangerous it was to be forgotten. So tonight, you've stepped behind the velvet curtains, past the clean-cut lines of history books, and into the shadows where the real stories breathe. You've walked the gardens, knelt at the altar, listened to the wind rattle the windows of the king's bedchamber, and now, as the candle of the Tudor dynasty flickers out, you leave not with scandal on your lips, but a strange sort of admiration. Not because they were perfect, but because they existed at all, and left traces strong enough to still reach you here centuries later. Now close your eyes. They're quiet again, but they were never really gone.